It was August 14th, 1980, a date etched into my memory like the deep grooves worn into the steering wheel of my old Peterbilt. I'm Charles Smith, 70 years old now, but back then I was a spry 26-year-old with nearly a decade of trucking under my belt. Little did I know that this particular haul would change my life forever. The day started like any other. I was tasked with transporting a load of lumber from a mill in Klamath Falls, Oregon, down to a bustling construction site in Reno, Nevada. It was a route I'd driven countless times, but this time I decided to take a shortcut, a decision that would haunt me for years to come. The highway I chose was barely more than a glorified logging road, snaking its way through the dense forests of the Cascade Range. It was the kind of route only U.S. truckers and a handful of locals knew about, narrow, winding, and treacherous, but it shaved a good 2 hours off the trip. Time is money in this business, and I was all about maximizing my profits. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows across the road, I decided to pull over at a small truck stop near the Oregon-Nevada border. It was one of those blink-and-you'll-miss-it places, just a weathered diner, a rusty gas pump, and a gravel lot big enough for a few rigs. The neon sign above the diner flickered weakly, casting a sickly blue glow over the empty parking lot. Mabel's Truck Stop, it read, though half the letters had long since burnt out. I eased my rig into a spot and climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside. The diner was nearly empty, save for a couple of other truckers hunched over their coffee cups at the far end of the counter. The air was thick with the smell of grease and cigarette smoke. A middle-aged woman with frizzy gray hair pulled back in a messy bun looked up from wiping down the counter. Her name tag read Mabel, and I figured she must be the owner. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, each line telling a story of hard years and harder miles. "Well, ain't you a sight for sore eyes?" Mabel said, her voice rough as sandpaper. "What'll it be, hun?" I slid onto a stool at the counter. "Coffee, black as midnight, and whatever's hot on the grill." Mabel nodded, pouring me a cup of coffee that looked strong enough to strip paint. "You're new round here," she observed, sliding the mug across the counter. I took a sip, surprised by how good it was. "Just passing through," I replied, taking the shortcut down to Reno. Mabel's eyes narrowed and she leaned in close. The smell of stale cigarettes clung to her uniform. "You be careful on that road, sugar. Not everyone makes it through there." I chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "What, you got bears or something?" She didn't laugh. Her face remained deadly serious. "Worse than bears, hun. Just be careful." Before I could press her for details, she turned away to fetch my food. I sat there, nursing my coffee and mulling over her cryptic warning. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of a superstitious local, but something in her eyes had me on edge. The plate she set in front of me was piled high with greasy hash browns, runny eggs and bacon that looked like it had been fried within an inch of its life. But after hours on the road, it tasted like a 5-star meal. As I ate, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The other truckers at the end of the counter were speaking in hushed tones, casting furtive glances my way. When I caught one of them staring, he quickly looked away, suddenly very interested in his coffee. I finished my meal in silence, left a generous tip for Mabel, and headed back out to my rig. The night had grown pitch black, the kind of darkness that seems to swallow up everything beyond your headlights. As I climbed into the cab, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. The engine roared to life, and I pulled back onto the highway. The trees seemed to press in on either side, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers trying to snatch at my truck. The only sounds were the hum of my tires on the pavement and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I'd been driving for about an hour when I saw something up ahead. Hazard lights flashed in the darkness. A car pulled over on the shoulder. As I drew closer, I could make out the silhouette of a man waving his arms frantically. Every instinct told me to keep driving. Mabel's warning echoed in my head, but I couldn't just leave someone stranded out here in the middle of nowhere. I slowed the rig and pulled over, my brakes hissing as I came to a stop. I rolled down my window, peering out into the darkness. A man emerged from the shadows, approaching my truck. He looked to be in his mid-30s, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. A Red Sox cap was pulled low over his eyes. "Thank God," he said, his voice tinged with relief. "My car broke down and I haven't seen another soul for hours. Any chance you could give me a lift to the next town?" I hesitated. Something about the guy seemed off, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Maybe it was the way his eyes darted around nervously, or how his hand kept twitching towards his pocket. But it was late, and he looked desperate. Against my better judgment, I nodded. "All right, hop in, but I'm warning you, the next town is a good ways off." He climbed into the passenger seat, and I caught a whiff of something sour like fear sweat. "Name's Eddie," he said, extending a hand. I shook it briefly, noticing how cold and clammy it felt. "Charles," I replied, putting the truck in gear and pulling back onto the road. We drove in silence for a while. Eddie kept fidgeting, glancing around the cab nervously. I tried to make small talk, but he just gave me one-word answers, his attention clearly elsewhere. After a few miles, I noticed he kept staring at my glove compartment. His hand twitched towards it, then pulled back, as if he was fighting some internal battle. "You got a gun in there?" he asked suddenly, his voice tight. I shook my head, keeping my eyes on the road. "Nope, don't believe in carrying one." Eddie nodded, but I could see the gears turning in his head. Something wasn't right, and I was starting to regret my decision to pick him up. As we rounded a bend, my headlights illuminated something in the road ahead. A massive tree had fallen across the highway, completely blocking our path. I cursed under my breath and brought the truck to a stop. I reached for the flashlight I kept under the seat. "Guess we'll have to see if we can move it," I said, more to break the tension than anything else. Eddie didn't move. His face had gone pale, and he was staring straight ahead, his eyes wide with, was that fear? "You go ahead," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll wait here." I narrowed my eyes at him. "In the dark? What are you afraid of?" He didn't answer, just kept staring ahead like he'd seen a ghost. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped out of the truck, leaving the door open. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the massive trunk of the fallen tree. It was old growth, far too heavy for us to move on our own. As I walked towards it, I heard Eddie's door open and close behind me. I spun around, catching him in the flashlight beam as he sprinted into the woods. "Hey," I shouted, "where the hell are you going?" But he was already gone, swallowed up by the darkness between the trees. I stood there for a moment, torn between chasing after him and staying with my truck. Something was very wrong here, and every instinct told me to get back in my rig and get the hell out of there. But curiosity got the better of me. Or maybe it was just plain stubbornness. Either way, I found myself following Eddie's path into the woods. The forest was dense, the underbrush snagging at my clothes as I pushed through. I could hear Eddie crashing through the trees ahead of me, but he was moving fast, driven by some unseen urgency. "Eddie," I called out, "where the hell are you going?" No answer came back, just the sound of breaking branches and rustling leaves. I kept walking, my senses on high alert. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches creating grotesque shapes in the dim light of my flashlight. Every shadow looked like a potential threat. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I found myself at the edge of a clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked like something out of a horror movie, all sagging roof and broken windows. A faint light flickered behind one of the dirty panes. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The porch steps creaked ominously under my weight. I raised my hand to knock, then thought better of it. Instead, I pushed the door open slowly, wincing at the loud groan of rusted hinges. The cabin was small, just one room with a table, a couple of chairs, and a bed in the corner. A single oil lantern cast a dim, flickering light, throwing long shadows across the walls. And there, sitting at the table, was Eddie. But he wasn't alone. Across from him sat another man, older, with a grizzled beard and cold, dead eyes. He looked up as I entered, a wolfish grin spreading across his face. "Well, well," the older man said, his voice dripping with menace. "Look what we have here." I backed towards the door, but the older man stood up, blocking my escape. "You're not going anywhere, friend." I glanced at Eddie, who looked like he was about to bolt again. His face was a mask of terror, his eyes darting between me and the older man. "What's going on here?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The older man chuckled, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "Just a little business transaction. Eddie here owes me, and you're going to help him pay up." Before I could react, the older man lunged at me, a wicked-looking knife flashing in his hand. I managed to dodge at the last second, the blade grazing my arm. I felt a sharp sting, followed by the warm trickle of blood. Adrenaline surged through me. I grabbed one of the chairs and swung it at him with all my might. It connected with a satisfying thud, sending him staggering back. But he didn't go down. Eddie took that moment to make a run for it, darting out the door and into the night. I didn't have time to chase him. The older man recovered quickly, slashing at me again with renewed fury. I kicked the table towards him, buying myself a few precious seconds. My eyes darted around the room looking for anything I could use as a weapon. That's when I saw it. An old hunting rifle mounted on the wall. I made a desperate lunge for it, ripping it off the wall just as the older man charged at me again. I swung the rifle like a club, catching him in the side. He went down hard, gasping for breath. My hands shaking, I checked the rifle. By some miracle, it was loaded. I aimed it at the older man, who was slowly getting to his feet. "Stay down," I warned, my voice hoarse. He laughed, a harsh, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "You don't have the guts, trucker." Maybe he was right. I'd never shot anyone before. But as he lunged at me again, knife raised, I knew I had no choice. I pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening in the small cabin. The older man's eyes went wide with surprise, then glazed over as he collapsed to the floor. Blood began to pool around him, soaking into the worn floorboards. I stood there, breathing hard, the rifle still aimed at his lifeless body. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, mixing with the metallic scent of blood. Eddie was long gone, but I didn't care. I needed to get out of there, to put as much distance between myself and this nightmare as possible. I left the cabin on unsteady legs, making my way back through the dark forest. It felt like hours before I finally stumbled out onto the road, my truck a welcome sight in the pre-dawn light. I climbed into the cab and locked the doors, my hands still shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I sat there for a long time trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wanted to just drive away and pretend none of this had ever happened, but I knew I couldn't do that. With trembling fingers, I reached for the CB radio and called for help. It took a while to explain my location, but eventually I heard the blessed sound of sirens in the distance. The police arrived about an hour later, their cruisers kicking up dust as they pulled to a stop behind my truck. I led them back to the cabin, half afraid that I'd imagined the whole thing, but the body was still there, just as I'd left it. They searched the woods, but there was no sign of Eddie. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. I spent hours answering questions, telling and retelling my story until my voice was hoarse. In the end, they ruled it self-defense, but that didn't make me feel any better. I'd taken a life, and that weight would stay with me forever. They let me go eventually, and I climbed back into my truck. The lumber still needed to be delivered, after all. The world didn't stop turning just because my life had been turned upside down. I finished my delivery in Reno and headed back home, but things were never the same after that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that Eddie was still out there somewhere, waiting. Every time I passed a broken-down car or saw someone hitchhiking, I thought of him. It's been over 4 decades since that night, but it still haunts me. I've seen a lot of things on the road in my 50 years of trucking, but nothing like that, and I hope I never do again. So if you ever find yourself driving down a lonely highway in the dead of night, and you see a stranded driver waving for help, think twice before you stop. You never know what kind of trouble you might be inviting into your life. Sometimes it's better to just keep on driving. The weeks leading up to the trip passed in a blur of deadlines and preparations. I surprised myself by actually looking forward to the getaway. I even went so far as to buy a new pair of hiking boots and a waterproof jacket, determined not to be the stereotypical city slicker out of his element. The morning of October 15th dawned crisp and clear. I loaded my bags into my Subaru Outback, a concession to Seattle living that I'd never quite gotten used to, and set out for the rendezvous point Ethan had specified. We'd agreed to meet at a small diner just outside of North Bend, the last outpost of civilization before heading into the mountains. As I pulled into the parking lot of the Timber Creek Diner, I spotted Ethan immediately. He was leaning against a rugged-looking Jeep, a broad grin spreading across his face as he saw me. Time had been kind to him. He still had the same athletic build and easy charm that had made him so popular in college. "Noah," he called out, striding over to pull me into a bear hug. "Man, it's good to see you. You haven't changed a bit." I laughed, returning the hug somewhat awkwardly. "I wish that were true. Pretty sure I've got a few more gray hairs since the last time we met." "Distinguishing, my friend. Very distinguishing," Ethan chuckled. He glanced at his watch. "Marcus should be here soon. Why don't we grab a coffee while we wait?" We headed into the diner, a cozy place that seemed to be a favorite among hikers and truckers. As we slid into a booth, I took a moment to really look at Ethan. There was something different about him, beyond the obvious changes that come with age. A nervous energy, perhaps, or a glint in his eye that I couldn't quite place. So I began, wrapping my hands around a steaming mug of coffee. "Tell me more about this Shadowvale place." I tried looking it up online, but there wasn't much information. Ethan's eyes lit up. "That's part of its charm, Noah. It's one of those places that's managed to stay off the grid, you know? No tourist traps, no gift shops selling tacky t-shirts. Just pure, unspoiled wilderness and a small community that likes to keep to itself." I raised an eyebrow. "Sounds quaint. But what made you choose it for our reunion?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, something flickering across his face that I couldn't quite read. "Well, to be honest, it's not just about reconnecting. There's something I need to investigate out there, and I could use your help, both of you." Before I could press him for details, the bell above the diner's door jingled. We both turned to see a tall, lanky man with wild, graying hair and thick-rimmed glasses step inside. It took me a moment to recognize him as Marcus. "Well, well," Marcus boomed, his voice carrying across the diner. "If it isn't the dynamic duo. Still trying to save the world one line of code at a time, Noah?" I groaned inwardly. So much for mellowing out. As Marcus slid into the booth next to me, I caught a whiff of patchouli and something else, an herbal scent I couldn't quite place. He grinned at us both, his eyes slightly bloodshot but alert. "So, gentlemen," he said, rubbing his hands together, "are we ready for our grand adventure into the heart of darkness?" Ethan shot him a warning look. "Come on, Marcus, don't start with the dramatics. I told you, this is just a relaxing weekend getaway." Marcus held up his hands in mock surrender. Of course, just a normal trip to a town that barely exists on any map. Nothing unusual about that at all." I looked between them, feeling like I was missing something. Okay, what's really going on here? Ethan, you mentioned something about an investigation. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I was hoping to wait until we got to the cabin to get into all this, but all right. The truth is, I've been doing some research into Shadowvale's history. There have been reports, strange sightings in the woods, people going missing, and lately, whispers of something big stirring in the mountains. Marcus leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. We're talking cryptid territory, my friend. Bigfoot, amateur hour. This is something else entirely. I felt a chill run down my spine, not entirely from excitement. And you didn't think this was worth mentioning in your email? Ethan at least had the grace to look sheepish. Would you have come if I had? I opened my mouth to protest, then closed it again. He had a point. Look, Ethan continued, I'm not asking you to believe anything right now. Just come with us, keep an open mind, and help me look into this. If it turns out to be nothing, we still get a great weekend in a beautiful location. What do you say? I looked from Ethan's earnest face to Marcus's barely concealed excitement. Part of me wanted to get up, walk out of the diner, and drive straight back to Seattle. But a larger part, the part that had been drowning in routine and predictability, was intrigued. All right, I said finally, I'm in, but if this turns out to be some elaborate prank, you're both paying for my therapy sessions. Ethan grinned, clapping me on the shoulder. That's the spirit. Trust me, Noah, this is going to be a weekend you'll never forget. As we finished our coffee and headed out to our vehicles, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into something far bigger than a simple reunion. The mountains loomed ahead, shrouded in mist, seeming to hold secrets in their ancient, tree-covered slopes. Whatever awaited us in Shadowvale, I had a feeling our lives would never be the same. The drive to Shadowvale was an exercise in isolation. As we left the main highway, following Ethan's Jeep in a small convoy, the roads became increasingly narrow and winding. The lush evergreen forests pressed in on both sides, creating a tunnel of green that seemed to swallow us whole. About an hour into our journey, we lost cell phone reception. I watched the bars on my phone disappear one by one, feeling a twinge of anxiety. I was more dependent on technology than I liked to admit, and being cut off from the digital world was unsettling. Marcus, riding shotgun in my Subaru, seemed to sense my discomfort. Relax, Noah, he said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. Sometimes disconnecting from the matrix is exactly what we need to reconnect with ourselves. I shot him a sidelong glance. That doesn't sound like the Marcus I remember. What happened to the government is using cell towers to control our minds. He chuckled, a rueful sound. Let's just say I've expanded my perspectives. There are bigger things to worry about than government mind control these days. Before I could ask what he meant by that, we rounded a bend and I had to slam on the brakes. Ethan's Jeep had come to a stop in front of us, half hidden by the mist that had begun to settle over the road. I got out of the car, stretching my legs and breathing in the crisp mountain air. The silence was profound. No traffic noise, no hum of electricity, just the soft whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional call of a bird I couldn't identify. Ethan jogged back to us, a map in his hands. Slight problem, he said, his brow furrowed. The road ahead is washed out. Must have been that storm last week. Marcus peered at the map over Ethan's shoulder. Is there another way around? Ethan nodded, tracing a route with his finger. There's an old logging road that should connect back to the main road to Shadowvale. It'll add a couple of hours to the trip, though. I glanced at my watch, then remembered it was useless out here. The sun, barely visible through the canopy of trees, seemed to be sinking faster than it should. Do we have enough daylight left? Ethan's face set in a determined expression. We don't have much choice. The cabin's already paid for, and turning back now would mean a long drive back in the dark anyway. We'll just have to push on and hope for the best. As we got back into our vehicles and began the detour, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The logging road was little more than a dirt track, rutted and overgrown in places. My Subaru, more at home on city streets than wilderness trails, groaned in protest as we bounced over rocks and fallen branches. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees growing taller and more gnarled. Shadows deepened, taking on strange, almost menacing shapes in the fading light. More than once I could have sworn I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there when I turned to look. "Did you see that?" I asked Marcus at one point, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. He leaned forward, peering intently into the gathering gloom. "See what?" I shook my head, feeling foolish. "Nothing. Just my imagination, I guess." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was low and serious. "The veil between worlds is thin in places like this, Noah. The old forests remember things we've long forgotten. It's best to keep your wits about you." I wanted to scoff at his mystical ramblings, but something in his tone made me hold my tongue. Instead, I focused on following the red glow of Ethan's taillights, our only guide through the deepening darkness. It was fully night by the time we finally emerged onto what passed for a main road in these parts. A weathered wooden sign, barely visible in our headlights, welcomed us to Shadowvale. Population 215. The town itself was little more than a collection of rustic buildings clustered around a single main street. Most of the windows were dark, but a few warm glows hinted at life within. As we passed through, I caught glimpses of curious faces peering out at us. Newcomers were clearly a rarity here. We didn't stop, pushing on through the town and back into the wilderness beyond. Finally, after what felt like hours of tense driving, Ethan's Jeep turned onto a narrow driveway nearly hidden by overgrown bushes. The cabin loomed before us, a solid structure of rough-hewn logs that seemed to grow organically from the forest floor. It was larger than I had expected, 2 stories tall with a wide porch wrapping around the front. As we pulled to a stop and killed the engines, the silence rushed in like a physical force. No traffic noise, no hum of electricity, just the soft susurration of wind through leaves and the distant call of some nocturnal bird. We got out of our vehicles, stretching stiff muscles and breathing in the sharp, pine-scented air. Ethan fumbled with a set of keys, finally managing to unlock the cabin's front door. It swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through the trees. "Well, gentlemen," Ethan said, flicking on a light switch that illuminated a cozy living room, "welcome to our home for the next few days." As we brought in our bags and began to settle in, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I found myself glancing repeatedly at the windows, half expecting to see a face pressed against the glass. But there was nothing there, just our own reflections and the impenetrable darkness beyond. Later, as we sat around the fireplace nursing beers and catching up on the years we'd been apart, I finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at me since the diner. "All right, Ethan," I said, setting down my beer bottle. "You promised us some answers. What exactly are we doing out here?" Ethan leaned forward, his face serious in the flickering firelight. "It's a long story, but I'll try to give you the short version. About 6 months ago, I was doing some research for a book I'm writing on rural folklore. I stumbled across some old newspaper articles about Shadowvale. At first, it seemed like typical small-town stuff, local festivals, town meetings, that sort of thing. But then I started noticing a pattern." He pulled out a laptop from his bag and opened it, turning it so we could see the screen. "Every few decades, there's a spike in missing persons reports, not just hikers or tourists, but locals too. And each time there are reports of strange sightings in the woods, lights, unexplained noises, and—" He paused, seeming to brace himself. "A creature, something big, something that shouldn't exist." Marcus leaned in, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "I knew it. What kind of creature are we talking about here? Wendigo? Sasquatch? Ethan shook his head. That's just it. The descriptions vary. Some say it's like a massive wolf. Others describe it as more bear-like. But they all agree on one thing. It's intelligent. Too intelligent. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. And you think this thing is real? I don't know, Ethan admitted, but I do know that people are going missing again. 3 in the last month alone. The local authorities are baffled. That's why I'm here to investigate, to try and find out what's really going on. I took a long swig of my beer trying to process this information. And where do we fit into all this? Ethan smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. I need your help, Noah. You've got a knack for patterns, for seeing connections that others miss. And Marcus, your knowledge of folklore and mythology could be invaluable. Together, we might be able to uncover the truth. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Ethan's words hanging in the air. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, to tell Ethan he'd been reading too many horror novels. But another part, a part I didn't quite understand, was intrigued, excited even. I'm in, Marcus said suddenly, his voice firm. Whatever's out there, I want to see it for myself. They both turned to look at me. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. This is crazy, you know that, right? But, all right, I'll help. Where do we start? Ethan's face broke into a relieved grin. We start tomorrow. I've arranged to meet with some of the locals, people who've had encounters or know someone who's gone missing. For now, though, we should get some sleep. It's been a long day. As we headed to our respective rooms, I couldn't shake a feeling of foreboding. The cabin suddenly felt too big, too empty, the shadows in the corners too deep. I lay in bed for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest, before finally drifting into an uneasy sleep. I woke with a start, heart pounding, unsure of what had disturbed my sleep. The room was pitch black, the kind of darkness you only find far from city lights. As my eyes adjusted, I became aware of a sound, a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to be coming from outside. Carefully, I made my way to the window, peering out into the night. The forest was a wall of blackness, broken only by slivers of moonlight filtering through the trees. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then a movement caught my eye. Something was moving through the trees, something big. I caught glimpses of it, a massive dark shape slipping between the trunks with an ease that belied its size. The thumping sound grew louder, and with a jolt of fear, I realized what it was. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that shook the ground. I stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. The shape paused at the edge of the clearing where our cabin stood. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it was going to emerge into the open. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the shadows of the forest. I remained at the window for what felt like hours, straining my eyes and ears for any sign of the creature's return. But there was nothing, just the normal sounds of the night forest. When dawn finally broke, I stumbled downstairs to find Ethan and Marcus already up, huddled over mugs of coffee at the kitchen table. You look like hell, Marcus observed, raising an eyebrow. I collapsed into a chair, gratefully accepting the mug of coffee Ethan pushed towards me. I saw something last night, I said, my voice hoarse. Outside in the woods. I don't know what it was, but it was big. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes intense. Tell us everything. I recounted what I'd seen, trying to recall every detail. As I spoke, I saw Ethan and Marcus exchange a look. What? I demanded. What aren't you telling me? Marcus cleared his throat. I heard it too, the footsteps. I thought I was dreaming, but this is good, Ethan said, his voice excited. This means we're on the right track. Whatever's out there, it's real, and it's close. I stared at him incredulously. Good? Ethan, there's something out there that could probably tear this cabin apart with its bare hands, and you think that's good? He had the grace to look sheepish. I know how it sounds, Noah, but think about it. If we can prove this thing exists, if we can document it somehow, it could change everything. The scientific implications alone. Forget science, Marcus interrupted. If this creature is real, it's not just a scientific discovery. It's a window into a world we've forgotten, a connection to the old magics that still linger in places like this. I looked between them, feeling a headache building behind my eyes. You're both insane, I muttered, completely insane. But even as I said it, I knew I was in too deep to back out now. Whatever was out there in those woods, whatever secrets Shadowvale was hiding, I was a part of it now. After breakfast, we headed into town. Shadowvale looked different in the daylight, less menacing, but no less strange. The buildings were a mix of old and new, as if the town had grown in fits and starts over the years. People on the street eyed us curiously as we passed, their expressions a mix of wariness and intrigue. Our first stop was the local diner, a cozy place called the Whispering Pine. The bell above the door jingled as we entered, and every head in the place turned to look at us. The conversation, which had been a low murmur, died away to silence. An older woman behind the counter, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, broke the tension with a warm smile. "Welcome to Shadowvale, boys," she said. "What can I get for you?" As we settled into a booth and ordered coffee, I noticed Ethan scanning the diner, his eyes lingering on an elderly man seated at the counter. After a few minutes, Ethan stood up. "I'll be right back," he said, then made his way over to the old man. I watched as Ethan struck up a conversation, his body language casual but his eyes intent. After a few minutes, the old man nodded and followed Ethan back to our table. "Noah, Marcus, this is Harold Blackwood," Ethan said. "He's lived in Shadowvale his whole life. Mr. Blackwood, these are my friends I told you about." Harold eased himself into the booth next to Marcus, his weathered face creased with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. "Ethan here tells me you boys are interested in our local history," he said, his voice gravelly with age. I shot Ethan a questioning look, but he just nodded encouragingly. "That's right, Mr. Blackwood," I said. "We're particularly interested in some of the, unusual occurrences in the area." Harold's eyes narrowed. "Unusual occurrences, eh? You mean the disappearances, the thing in the woods?" A chill ran down my spine. "You've seen it?" I asked. The old man was quiet for a long moment, his gnarled hands wrapped around his coffee mug. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "It was 60 years ago. I was just a boy. My PA and I were out hunting, deeper in the mountains than we usually went. We were tracking a deer, but something was tracking us." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. The diner had gone quiet again, other patrons openly listening now. We heard it before we saw it. A sound like thunder, but on the ground. The trees shook. And then we saw it. Just for a moment, mind you. But a moment was enough. "What did it look like?" Marcus asked, leaning forward eagerly. Harold shook his head. "It's hard to describe. Bigger than any animal I've ever seen. Walked on 2 legs, but it weren't no bear. Had a face that was almost human, but not quite. Eyes that glowed in the dark. My PA, he grabbed me and we ran all the way back to town. Never went that deep into the woods again." A heavy silence fell over the table. I found myself glancing out the window, half expecting to see a monstrous shape looming over the town. "Has anyone else seen it?" Ethan asked. "Recently, I mean?" Harold nodded slowly. "There's been talk. Hikers reporting strange noises. A couple of loggers swear they saw something big moving through the trees a few weeks back. And then there's the missing folks." "The missing people," I said. "What can you tell us about them?" The old man's face grew grave. 3 of them in the past month. 2 tourists, a young couple camping up in the hills, and old Joe, the hermit who lived out by Crescent Lake. All of them just vanished. No trace. As Harold continued to talk, filling us in on the details of the disappearances and other strange occurrences around Shadowvale, I felt a growing sense of unease. This was more than just local superstition or an overactive imagination. Something was happening here, something dangerous. We spent the rest of the day talking to other locals, piecing together a patchwork of stories and sightings. Some were reluctant to talk, eyeing us suspiciously and changing the subject. Others, like Harold, seemed almost relieved to finally have someone listen to them. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town, we headed back to the cabin. The forest seemed different now, alive with hidden menace. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me jump. Back at the cabin, we gathered around the kitchen table, spreading out maps and the notes we'd taken throughout the day. Ethan had a gleam in his eye that I recognized from our college days, the look he got when he was on to something big. "All right," he said, pointing to various spots on the map. "If we overlay the locations of all the sightings and disappearances, we start to see a pattern. They're all concentrated in this area here, about 5 miles north of town." Marcus leaned in, studying the map. "That's deep wilderness, no roads, no trails. Why would anyone be out there?" Ethan shrugged. "That's what we need to find out. I think we should head out there tomorrow, see if we can find any clues." I stared at him in disbelief. "You want us to go looking for this thing? Are you insane?" "We'll be careful," Ethan assured me. "We'll stick together, bring supplies. If we see anything suspicious, we'll head straight back. But this might be our only chance to get some real evidence." I wanted to argue, to tell Ethan this was a terrible idea, but I could see the determination in his eyes, and I knew there would be no talking him out of it, and if he was going, I couldn't let him go alone. "Fine," I said reluctantly, "but we need to be prepared, really prepared." We spent the next few hours going over our plan, checking and double-checking our gear. As I finally crawled into bed, exhaustion overtaking my anxiety, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping into something far bigger and more dangerous than we could handle. In my dreams that night, I wandered through an endless forest, the trees whispering secrets I couldn't quite understand, and always, just at the edge of my vision, a massive shape moved through the shadows, watching, waiting. The next morning dawned gray and misty, the forest shrouded in a haze that seemed to muffle sound and blur the edges of reality. We set out early, our backpacks laden with supplies, water, food, first aid kits, and other essentials. Ethan had also packed some high-tech gear motion sensor cameras, a digital recorder for EVP sessions, and a night vision monocular. As we pushed deeper into the wilderness, following the rough path Ethan had charted, the forest grew denser, the trees older and more gnarled. The undergrowth was thick, grabbing at our legs and slowing our progress. More than once I found myself glancing over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched. Marcus seemed to be in his element, his eyes bright with excitement as he pointed out various plants and fungi, regaling us with their medicinal or mythological properties. Ethan was focused, constantly checking our position against his map and making notes in a small weathered journal. We had been hiking for several hours when we came across the first sign that something was amiss. In a small clearing, the underbrush had been flattened in a wide circle, as if something large had been resting there. At the center of the circle was a strange viscous substance that none of us could identify. "What do you think?" Ethan asked, crouching down to examine the scene more closely. Marcus ran his fingers through the flattened grass, his brow furrowed. "This wasn't made by any animal I'm familiar with. The pattern is all wrong for a bear or deer, and this substance—" He touched the viscous fluid gingerly, then brought his fingers to his nose. "It doesn't smell like anything I recognize." I stood at the edge of the clearing, my nerves jangling. "Guys, maybe we should head back. We've got some evidence now, right? We can analyze that. Whatever it is, back at the cabin. Ethan shook his head, his jaw set stubbornly. We're close to something. I can feel it. We need to push on a little further. Reluctantly, I fell in line as we continued our trek. The forest seemed to grow darker as we walked, the canopy above thickening until only occasional shafts of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. The air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation. It was late afternoon when we stumbled upon the cave. Half hidden by a curtain of vines, its mouth yawned black and forbidding in the face of a steep hillside. The ground around the entrance was muddy, and in that mud were tracks, huge misshapen prints that sent a shiver of fear down my spine. This is it, Ethan breathed, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. This has to be its lair. Marcus was already examining the tracks, his face pale but determined. These are fresh, he said. Whatever made them, it passed by here recently. Within the last few hours, I'd guess. I took a step back, every instinct screaming at me to run. We need to leave, now. We're not equipped to deal with whatever made those tracks. But Ethan was already pulling out his flashlight, testing its beam against the darkness of the cave mouth. We can't turn back now, Noah. This might be our only chance to get real, incontrovertible evidence. We'll just take a quick look inside, set up a couple of cameras, then head back. I promise. I wanted to argue, to grab both of them and drag them back down the mountain. But I knew Ethan was right. We had come too far to turn back now. With a resigned sigh, I pulled out my own flashlight and fell in line behind Ethan as we stepped into the cave. The darkness swallowed us immediately, our flashlight beams seeming feeble against the oppressive blackness. The air was cool and damp, with an underlying scent that made my stomach churn, a mix of wet fur, rotting meat, and something else, something alien and indescribable. We moved slowly, our footsteps echoing in the confined space. The cave tunnel twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the heart of the mountain. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, a steady plink-plink that seemed to mark the passing of time. Look, Marcus whispered, pointing his flashlight at the cave wall. In the beam we could see strange markings, crude drawings that seemed to depict massive, misshapen creatures towering over tiny human figures. Ethan pulled out his camera, snapping pictures of the drawings. These look ancient, he murmured, but some of them look newer, like they've been added to over time. A chill ran down my spine. Guys, I really think we should... My words were cut off by a sound that made my blood run cold, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The cave walls trembled, small pebbles skittering across the floor. Run, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Run! We turned and fled, our earlier caution forgotten in our panic. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly as we ran, casting monstrous shadows on the cave walls. Behind us, the growl grew louder, accompanied now by the sound of heavy footfalls. We burst out of the cave into the fading daylight, gasping for air. But our relief was short-lived. As we stumbled to a halt in the small clearing before the cave mouth, we realized our mistake. We weren't alone. Standing between us and the path back down the mountain was a creature that defied description. It was massive, easily 9 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be a nightmarish blend of bear, wolf, and something distinctly inhuman. Its fur was matted and patchy, revealing skin that seemed to shift and ripple unnaturally. But it was the face that truly froze me in place, a face that was almost human, but twisted with eyes that glowed with an otherworldly intelligence. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stood frozen, staring at the creature. It stared back, its head tilted in an almost curious manner. Then, slowly, deliberately, it opened its mouth, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth, and it spoke. The words were garbled, guttural, barely recognizable as language, but somehow impossibly I understood them. "You should not be here. Ethan, his face pale but determined, took a shaky step forward. We don't mean any harm," he said, his voice quavering slightly. "We just want to understand. What are you?" The creature's eyes narrowed, and for a heart-stopping moment I thought it was going to attack. But then it did something even more terrifying. It laughed. The sound was like rocks grinding together, echoing through the forest. "You seek knowledge," it growled, "but some things are not meant to be known." With surprising speed for its size, the creature turned and loped into the forest, disappearing among the trees in seconds. We stood in stunned silence for several minutes, our minds struggling to process what we had just witnessed. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. Did that just happen?" I nodded numbly, my throat too dry to speak. Ethan was frantically checking his camera. "Please tell me I got that on video," he muttered. As the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep weariness, I found my voice. "We need to get out of here. Now." This time, there were no arguments. We made our way back down the mountain in tense silence, jumping at every sound, half expecting the creature to emerge from the shadows at any moment. But we saw no further sign of it, and as the lights of Shadowvale came into view, I felt myself beginning to relax. That night, huddled around the fireplace in our cabin, we tried to make sense of what we had seen. Ethan's camera had captured some footage, but it was blurry, indistinct, tantalizing, but far from the incontrovertible proof he had hoped for. "What do we do now?" I asked, nursing a strong cup of coffee laced with a generous splash of whiskey. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his eyes distant. "I don't know," he admitted. "We can't just ignore what we saw, but who would believe us?" Marcus, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since our encounter, spoke up. Maybe we're not meant to do anything. That thing, whatever it was, it's been here for a long time, longer than Shadowvale, longer than any of us. Maybe this is its home, and we're the intruders." We sat in silence for a long moment, pondering his words. Finally, I stood up. "Whatever we decide, it can wait until morning. I don't know about you guys, but I'm exhausted." As I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep despite my fatigue, I found myself thinking about the creature's words. Some things are not meant to be known. Was it a warning, a threat, or something else entirely? The next morning we packed up our belongings in silence. By unspoken agreement, we had decided to leave Shadowvale. As we drove out of town, I caught glimpses of the locals watching us from windows and porches. Their expressions were unreadable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew more than they had let on. We never spoke publicly about what we saw in those woods. Who would have believed us? But the experience changed us, in ways both subtle and profound. Ethan's book on rural folklore was never published. Instead, he turned his attention to conservation efforts, working to protect the wild places of the world. Marcus, to my surprise, became a park ranger, dedicating himself to preserving the forests he had once sought to unravel. As for me, I returned to my life in Seattle, to my job and my routines. But I was different now, more aware of the shadows at the edges of the world, of the mysteries that lurk just beyond our understanding. And sometimes on dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself thinking of Shadowvale, of the creature in the woods, and of the secrets that perhaps are best left undiscovered. Years have passed since our adventure in Shadowvale, but I still dream of it sometimes. In my dreams, I'm back in that forest, standing before the creature. But in these dreams, I'm not afraid. Instead, I feel a strange sense of kinship, of understanding. And as I wake, the creature's final words to us echo in my mind. You seek knowledge, but some things are not meant to be known. Perhaps in the end, that's the real lesson of Shadowvale, that there are mysteries in this world beyond our comprehension, forces that operate on a scale we can barely imagine. and that sometimes the wisest course of action is simply to acknowledge their existence, to respect their power, and to leave them to their ancient, inscrutable ways. As I sit here writing down this account of our strange adventure, I find myself wondering, if I had the chance to go back, to unravel the mystery of Shadow Vale once and for all, would I take it? Part of me, the curious knowledge-seeking part that drove us into those woods in the first place, says yes. But another part, a part that has grown wiser and more cautious with the years, hesitates. Some secrets, perhaps, are meant to remain secrets. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. And in the deep, dark woods of Shadow Vale, something ancient and powerful continues its vigil, a guardian of secrets beyond human understanding, a whisper in the shadows that will endure long after our brief candle has flickered out. It's been 5 years since that fateful week in the Arizona desert, but the memories still send a chill down my spine. Looking back, I can't help but chuckle at my former self, not because of what happened, mind you, but because of how stubbornly skeptical I was before it all unfolded. The arrogance of a man who thought he had the world figured out. Well, let's just say the universe has a way of humbling you. I'm Alex Hawthorne, 38 years old now. Back then I was your typical mid-30s tech professional with a penchant for the outdoors. Not a hardcore survivalist by any means, but I could handle myself on a challenging hike and knew my way around a campsite. I'd been bitten by the digital nomad bug, enchanted by all those picture-perfect Instagram posts of people living the hash van life dream. So, I decided to take the plunge, rented an RV, and set out to combine work and wanderlust in the great American Southwest. It was early October when I found myself cruising along Route 191 in eastern Arizona. The autumn air was crisp, carrying that distinct scent of sage and sun-baked earth. Towering saguaro cacti stood sentinel along the roadside, their arms reaching skyward like ancient guardians of the desert. I'd been on the road for about a week, alternating between established campgrounds and the occasional boondocking spot, when I stumbled upon what seemed like the perfect slice of solitude. Just off a lesser-traveled stretch of highway, I discovered a small, unmarked pullout. It wasn't on any of my maps or apps, which only added to its allure. The spot offered a breathtaking panorama of the Pinaleno Mountains in the distance, their peaks tinged with the first dustings of early snow. Closer at hand, a maze of rust-colored mesas and buttes created a landscape that seemed pulled straight from a John Ford Western. I maneuvered my rented 25-foot Class C RV into position, feeling a surge of satisfaction as I leveled it out. This, I thought, was what I'd been searching for. My own private slice of the Wild West, far from the crowds and noise of the more popular camping areas. That first evening was nothing short of magical. I set up my folding chair outside, cracked open a local craft IPA I'd picked up in Safford, and fired up the portable grill. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in impossible shades of orange and purple, I savored a meal of grilled chicken and roasted vegetables. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk or the whisper of wind through the scrub brush. As darkness fell, the stars emerged in a dazzling display. Growing up in Seattle, I'd never truly appreciated the night sky until moments like this. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light, and I found myself trying to recall long-forgotten constellations from my Boy Scout days. I stayed up far later than I'd intended, mesmerized by the celestial show and the utter tranquility of my surroundings. When I finally crawled into the RV's snug bedroom, I drifted off to sleep with a contented smile, already looking forward to waking up in this slice of paradise. The next morning, I rose with the sun, my body clock already adjusting to the natural rhythms of the desert. I brewed a strong pot of coffee and stepped outside, inhaling deeply as I surveyed my domain. The landscape looked different in the harsh light of day, no less beautiful but somehow more raw and unforgiving. After a light breakfast and some stretching to work out the kinks from a week of driving, I decided to explore the area on foot before settling in for a day of remote work. I'd noticed a faint trail leading up into the nearby hills, and the promise of an even more spectacular view was too tempting to resist. I packed a small day pack with water, some trail mix, and my camera. The October sun was already asserting itself, and I made sure to lather on plenty of sunscreen before setting out. The trail was rougher than it had appeared from a distance, winding its way through prickly pear cacti and around precariously balanced boulders. About a mile in, the path narrowed as it skirted the edge of a shallow arroyo. That's when I saw it, something so out of place, so deliberately unnatural, that it stopped me in my tracks. There, arranged with unsettling precision in the middle of the trail, was a collection of bones. At first glance, I thought they might belong to a coyote, or perhaps a small deer. But as I cautiously approached, the wrongness of the scene became even more apparent. The bones were bleached white by the sun, picked clean of any remnants of flesh or sinew. That in itself wasn't unusual in such an arid environment. No. What sent a chill through me despite the growing heat of the day was the way they had been arranged. The ribs formed a perfect arc like macabre fence posts. Leg bones were crossed at precise angles, creating a kind of framework. And there, perched atop this grisly structure, was the skull. Its empty eye sockets seemed to stare directly at me, jaws parted in a mirthless grin. This was no random scattering of remains left by scavengers. Someone or something had created this disturbing tableau with clear intent. But for what purpose? To mark territory? As some kind of twisted art installation? Or perhaps, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered, as a warning. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was the work of some bored local teens, I told myself, or an overzealous biology student conducting a misguided experiment. The alternative, that there was someone out here deliberately creating such unsettling displays, was not something I wanted to contemplate. Shaking off my unease, I snapped a few photos with my phone. If nothing else, it would make for an interesting story to share online later. I gave the bone arrangement a wide berth as I continued up the trail, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The rest of the hike passed without incident, and the view from the top of the hill was indeed spectacular. I could see for miles in every direction, the landscape a patchwork of ochre, rust, and sage green. My earlier discomfort began to fade as I basked in the beauty of my surroundings. By the time I made it back to the RV, it was early afternoon. I settled in at the small built-in desk, booted up my laptop, and tried to focus on work. But my mind kept drifting back to that eerie scene on the trail. I found myself Googling animal bone arrangements in the desert and similar phrases, but nothing I found quite matched what I'd seen. As evening approached, I felt a growing reluctance to venture outside. The vast open landscape that had seemed so inviting just 24 hours ago now felt oppressive, full of hidden threats. I kept the RV's curtains drawn as I prepared a simple dinner, jumping at every little sound. Night fell, and with it came an almost tangible darkness. The stars that had been so mesmerizing the previous evening now seemed cold and distant, offering no comfort. I tried to distract myself by streaming a movie on my tablet, but the patchy cell signal made it an exercise in frustration. It was just after midnight when I first heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from outside the RV. At first I dismissed it as branches scraping against the vehicle's exterior, carried by the wind. But there were no trees nearby, only low shrubs and cacti. The scratching grew more insistent, moving from one side of the RV to the other, It sounded almost deliberate, like something or someone was running their nails along the metal siding. My heart began to race, and I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear any other sounds that might give away the source of the disturbance. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was somehow even more unnerving. I sat frozen in my bed, covers pulled up to my chin like a child afraid of the monster in the closet. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an hour. Finally, gathering what courage I could muster, I crept to one of the windows and slowly peeled back the edge of the curtain. The moonlight cast everything in a silvery glow, but as far as I could see, there was nothing out there. No animals, no shadowy figures. Just the empty desert stretching away into the darkness. I barely slept that night, jolting awake at every creak of the RV's frame settling or gust of wind outside. When dawn finally broke, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. In the harsh light of day, my fears seemed silly and overblown. I chided myself for letting my imagination run wild, chalking it up to too many horror movies and the natural unease of being alone in an unfamiliar place. But as I went through my morning routine, I couldn't shake a lingering sense of unease. The coffee tasted bitter, the breakfast cereal bland. I found myself constantly glancing out the windows, half expecting to see something sinister lurking just out of sight. I tried to settle in for another day of work, but concentration proved impossible. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but my mind was a million miles away. Every few minutes I'd catch myself straining to hear any unusual sounds from outside. By mid-afternoon I'd had enough. I needed a change of scenery, something to reset my frayed nerves. I decided to drive into the nearest town, a small place called Wilcox about 30 miles away, for supplies and maybe a decent meal that I didn't have to cook myself. The drive did me good. As I put miles between myself and that isolated campsite, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. Wilcox turned out to be a charming little town, with a main street lined with Western-style storefronts and a surprising number of wine-tasting rooms. I browsed a few shops, restocked my groceries, and treated myself to a hearty lunch at a local diner. As I sat there, savoring a slice of homemade apple pie, I overheard a conversation at the next table that made my blood run cold. Two older men, weathered cowboys by the look of them, were talking in low voices about strange happenings out in the desert. "Third time this month," one of them was saying. "Ranger Mike says he's never seen anything like it in all his years on the job." The other man shook his head slowly. "Ain't natural, that's for sure. You hear about that family that went missing last spring? Never did find 'em or their camper." I tried to lean closer without being too obvious, straining to catch more of their conversation. But at that moment the waitress came by with their check, and the men's talk turned to more mundane matters. I wanted to approach them, to ask what exactly they had been discussing. But something held me back. Maybe it was the ingrained city dweller's reluctance to intrude on strangers' conversations, or perhaps a deeper fear of having my own unsettling experiences confirmed as something real and dangerous. As I drove back to my campsite, the sun was already sinking low on the horizon. The lengthening shadows seemed to reach out across the road like grasping fingers, and more than once I caught myself speeding up, irrationally afraid of being caught out here after dark. I arrived back at the RV just as the last light was fading from the sky. The familiar silhouette of my temporary home should have been reassuring, but instead it looked somehow ominous, a dark blot against the deepening twilight. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me with trembling hands. As I flicked on the lights, my eyes were drawn to something on the small dinette table that hadn't been there when I left. A single feather, jet black and impossibly large, at least a foot long. I stood there staring at it, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. I knew I had locked the RV before leaving, I always did. So how? The rational part of my brain scrambled for explanations. Maybe I had left a window cracked, and it had blown in somehow. Or perhaps I had picked it up on my hike the day before without realizing it, and it had only now fallen out of my clothes or backpack. But deep down, I knew these were feeble attempts to deny the impossible. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat at the dinette, a cup of cold coffee in front of me, my eyes never leaving that dark feather. Every sound from outside, the whisper of wind, the scurrying of some small nocturnal creature, set my nerves on edge. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the windows, I made a decision. Whatever was going on here, whatever strange forces were at work in this lonely stretch of desert, I wanted no part of it. I was leaving immediately. I packed up in record time, not even bothering with my usual meticulous organization. Clothes were shoved haphazardly into my duffel bag, electronics tossed carelessly into their cases. Within an hour, I was ready to go. As I did one final sweep of the RV to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything essential, my eyes fell on the feather still lying on the table. A part of me wanted to leave it behind, to pretend I had never seen it. But another part, the part that had always prided itself on facing challenges head-on, rebelled at the thought. In the end, I compromised. I took a plastic freezer bag from the kitchen and carefully sealed the feather inside. I told myself it was evidence, something I could show to park rangers or local authorities. But truthfully, I think I needed some tangible proof that what I had experienced was real. The drive back to Tucson, where I was due to return the RV, passed in a blur. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see something dark and ominous following behind. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching away into the distance. I've spent countless hours since then trying to make sense of what happened during those few days in the desert. I've researched local legends, pored over news reports of missing hikers and campers, even reached out to cryptozoologists and paranormal investigators. But I've found no satisfactory explanations, no neat resolution to tie it all together. The feather remains in its plastic bag, tucked away in a drawer in my home office. Sometimes late at night when the house is quiet and sleep eludes me, I take it out and examine it. In the harsh light of day it looks almost ordinary, just an unusually large bird feather, nothing more. But in those small hours of the morning, when the boundary between the rational world and the realm of nightmares seems thinnest, I swear I can feel a faint vibration coming from within that sealed bag. A pulse, like a distant heartbeat. I haven't been camping since that trip. The thought of sleeping in a tent or RV surrounded by the vast emptiness of nature fills me with a dread I can't quite shake. My friends and family have noticed the change in me, the way I tense up at the mention of road trips or starry nights in the wilderness. They attribute it to some undisclosed trauma, perhaps a close call with a wild animal or a dangerous fall on a hiking trail. I let them believe what they want. The truth I found is often too strange and terrible for most people to accept. But I know what I experienced out there in the Arizona desert. I know that there are things in this world that defy explanation, forces that operate beyond the boundaries of what we consider possible. And I know that sometimes the greatest danger lies not in facing these unknowns, but in refusing to acknowledge their existence. So I leave you with this warning. The next time you find yourself alone in the wilderness, far from the comforting lights of civilization, pay attention to the whispers on the wind and the shadows that move when they shouldn't. For in those remote places where the veil between worlds grows thin, you may discover that you are not as alone as you think. And whatever you do, if you hear scratching in the night, don't look outside. 5 years have passed since that harrowing experience in the Arizona desert, but its effects linger with me like a persistent shadow. I've tried to move on, to reclaim the life I had before, but some changes are irreversible. The Alex Hawthorne who drove into that desolate stretch of land died there, in a sense, replaced by the man I am today, more cautious, more aware, and infinitely more respectful of the unknown. In the months following my return, I threw myself into research. I scoured online forums, paranormal websites, and even academic journals for any information that might shed light on what I'd experienced. Most of what I found was easily dismissible: hoaxes, misidentifications, or the fevered imaginings of overactive minds. But there were a few accounts, buried deep in obscure corners of the internet, that resonated with a chilling familiarity. One story, posted anonymously on a cryptozoology message board, described an encounter in the Superstition Mountains, not far from where I had camped. The writer spoke of finding elaborate structures made from animal bones and experiencing a sense of being watched by something ancient and inhuman. The post was quickly deleted, but not before I had saved a copy. Another lead came from an unexpected source. About 6 months after my trip, I received an email from a man claiming to be one of the cowboys I had overheard in the Wilcox Diner. He had apparently noticed me eavesdropping and, after some internal debate, decided to reach out. His message was cryptic, warning me to leave well enough alone and that some things ain't meant for city folk to understand. I tried to press him for more information, but he refused to elaborate. His final email to me contained just one sentence: "If you value your sanity, burn that feather and forget everything you saw." Then he vanished, his email account deactivated. The feather. I had almost managed to convince myself that it was nothing more than an unusual specimen from some large desert bird. But deep down, I knew better. In the years since, I've had it analyzed by 3 different labs. Each time, the results came back inconclusive. The DNA didn't match any known species, and the structure of the feather itself was described as anomalous and theoretically impossible. I've been tempted more than once to follow the cowboy's advice and destroy it, but something always stops me. It's evidence, yes, but more than that, it's a tangible reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. To destroy it would feel like a betrayal of that knowledge, a willful return to ignorance that I'm not sure I could live with. My personal life has suffered in the wake of my obsession. I've withdrawn from friends and family, unable to fully explain the change that's come over me. I left my job in tech, unable to focus on mundane coding tasks, when my mind was constantly pulled back to that night in the desert. Instead, I've taken up freelance writing, penning articles on travel, and the outdoors for various websites and magazines. It's ironic, really. I haven't set foot in a national park or forest since that trip. Yet I make my living encouraging others to explore the wilderness. But perhaps the most significant change has been in my perception of the world around me. I've become hyper-aware of the thin veneer of normalcy that we drape over our daily lives. In the shadows between streetlights, in the rustle of leaves on a windy night, in the unexpected silence of a crowded room, I sense echoes of that otherworldly presence I encountered in the desert. I've tried therapy, meditation, even medication, but nothing fully dispels the lingering unease. It's not debilitating. I can function in society, maintain relationships, enjoy simple pleasures. But there's always a part of me that remains on guard, waiting for that telltale scratching sound or the appearance of another impossible feather. Last week, something happened that has reopened all the old wounds and fears. I received a package in the mail, unmarked except for my name and address. Inside was a small polished stone, deep black with flecks of iridescent blue. Wrapped around it was a scrap of paper bearing a single line of text. "It remembers you." The handwriting was unfamiliar, but I knew immediately where the stone must have come from. I've spent hours examining it, turning it over and over in my hands. In certain lights, I swear I can see shapes moving within its depths, suggestions of vast, dark wings and gleaming eyes. I don't know what this means. Is it a warning, an invitation, or something else entirely? Part of me wants to book a flight to Arizona immediately, to return to that lonely spot and confront whatever force is reaching out to me. But a larger part, the part that still wakes up in cold sweats remembering that night, knows that would be foolish, perhaps fatally so. So here I sit, a man caught between two worlds. In one I go about my daily life, write my articles, and try to find moments of peace and normalcy. In the other I am forever standing in that desert, feeling the weight of ancient, inhuman eyes upon me, knowing that the boundary between the known and the unknowable is far more permeable than we'd like to believe. I don't know what the future holds. Will I spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows? Or will there come a day when I'm forced to face whatever it was I encountered out there? The thought terrifies me, but there's a small, traitorous part of my mind that also finds it thrilling. The prospect of finally understanding, of pulling back the curtain on the mysteries that have consumed me for the past 5 years. For now, though, I wait. I keep the feather locked away, only examining it on those nights when the walls feel too close and sleep is a distant memory. I've placed the stone on my desk, a constant reminder of the choice that lies before me, to pursue the truth, wherever it may lead, or to try once more to forget and return to a life of blissful ignorance. But I know deep down that there is no real choice. Whatever force is at work here, whatever intelligence orchestrated those eerie occurrences in the desert, it's not finished with me. Sooner or later I'll be drawn back to that place of red rocks and endless sky to face whatever waits for me there. And so, dear reader, I leave you with this final thought. The world is vast and full of wonders, yes, but it also harbors secrets that might be better left uncovered. If you find yourself alone in the wild places of the earth, pay attention to the whispers on the wind and the shapes that move in the corner of your eye, for you never know when you might stumble upon a truth that will change you forever. As for me, I'll continue to watch and wait, caught between fear and fascination, never fully at peace. Because now I know that out there, in the sun-baked emptiness of the Arizona desert, something ancient and unknowable is also watching and waiting. The scratching you hear might just be the wind. The shadow you glimpse might be nothing more than a trick of the light. Or maybe, just maybe, it's something else entirely. Something that remembers you, something that's coming. Life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. One moment, you're cruising along, thinking you've got it all figured out, and the next, you're watching your world crumble around you. That's how it was for me anyway. The name's Jack Hawkins, and this is the story of how I found myself face to face with something that shouldn't exist, in a town that feels like it was plucked straight out of a Stephen King novel. It all started back in Rustville, Ohio, a forgettable little town with more shuttered factories than open businesses. I'd been working at the Rustville steel plant for the better part of 2 decades. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and kept food on the table for me and Sarah, my wife of 15 years. We weren't living the high life, but we were comfortable, or so I thought. The first domino fell on a dreary Tuesday in March. I walked into the plant, same as I had every day for years, only to be met with grim faces and hushed conversations. By lunchtime, the news had spread like wildfire. The plant was closing. Just like that, hundreds of us were out of a job. The severance package was a joke, barely enough to cover a month's expenses. I drove home that day in a daze, wondering how I was going to break the news to Sarah. As it turned out, I didn't have to. When I pulled into our driveway, there was a U-Haul truck parked out front. Sarah was loading boxes into it, assisted by a guy I'd never seen before. He was younger than me, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of build you get from spending hours in a gym rather than on a factory floor. "Sarah?" I called out, confusion and dread mixing in my gut. "What's going on?" She turned to face me, and I could see the guilt in her eyes warring with something else. Determination, maybe, or relief. "I'm leaving, Jack," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry." The next few minutes were a blur of accusations and explanations. The gist of it was that Sarah had been unhappy for years, feeling neglected and unfulfilled. The guy helping her load the truck, her yoga instructor, Derek, they'd been having an affair for months. "You were never there, Jack," Sarah said, tears in her eyes. "Even when you were home, you weren't really present. I needed more than that." I wanted to argue, to point out that I'd been working my ass off to provide for us, but the words stuck in my throat. In that moment, I realized that maybe she was right. I'd been so focused on making a living that I'd forgotten to make a life. So, just like that, I lost my job and my wife in the span of a few hours. Talk about a 1-2 punch. I stood in our driveway, my driveway now, I supposed, and watched as Sarah drove away with Derek, taking half of our shared life with her. The next few weeks passed in a haze of cheap whiskey and self-pity. I'd wake up, stare at the want ads in the local paper, then inevitably find myself at O'Malley's, the local dive bar. It was there, nursing my third, or was it fourth, bourbon of the night, that I overheard a conversation that would change the course of my life. Two guys at the end of the bar were talking about fishing spots. One of them mentioned a place called Lost Creek, somewhere up in northern Minnesota. Said the fishing was incredible, and the town was so small and quiet you could hear yourself think. Something about that struck a chord with me. Maybe it was the alcohol talking, or maybe it was some deep-seated need for escape. But suddenly the idea of packing up and heading to the middle of nowhere seemed like the best plan in the world. The next morning, nursing a killer hangover, I made a decision. I was going to Lost Creek. I had some savings, not much, but enough to keep me going for a while if I was careful. I packed up my old Ford F-150, threw my fishing gear in the back, and hit the road. The drive to Minnesota was long and lonely, giving me plenty of time to second-guess my decision. But with each mile that passed, I felt a little of the weight lift from my shoulders. By the time I crossed the state line into Minnesota, I was feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Lost Creek turned out to be even smaller than I'd imagined. The "Welcome to Lost Creek" sign was so faded you could barely read it, and the population count looked like it had been crossed out and rewritten several times, each number smaller than the last. The current count stood at a whopping 237 souls. The town itself was a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single main street. There was a general store, a small diner, a post office that looked like it hadn't seen much action since the advent of email, and not much else. But the real star of the show was the creek that gave the town its name. Lost Creek wound its way through the town like a silver ribbon, disappearing into the dense forest that surrounded the settlement on all sides. The water was clear as crystal, and I could see fish darting beneath the surface. My fingers itched to set up my rod right then and there. I pulled up to the only place in town that looked like it might offer accommodation, a collection of small cabins set back from the main road, with a weather-beaten sign proclaiming them to be Finnegan's Fishing Cabins. As I stepped out of my truck, stretching my road-weary muscles, I was greeted by the sight of an old man emerging from what I assumed was the main office. He was tall and lean, with a face that looked like it had been carved from weathered oak. His white hair was wild and unkempt, and his beard reached halfway down his chest. "You lost, son?" he called out, his voice gravelly but not unfriendly. I shook my head. "Looking for a place to stay, actually. You Mr. Finnegan?" He nodded, giving me a once-over with sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "That's right. Ezra Finnegan. You here for the fishing?" "That's the plan," I replied, extending my hand. "Jack Hawkins. Ezra's handshake was firm, his palm calloused from years of hard work. "Well, Jack Hawkins, you've come to the right place. Lost Creek's got the best fishing this side of the Mississippi. How long you planning on staying?" I hesitated. I hadn't really thought that far ahead. "Not sure," I admitted. "A while, I guess. I've got some things to figure out." Ezra nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. "Don't we all?" he muttered, then louder. "Well, I've got a cabin free. It ain't fancy, but it's clean and the roof don't leak. That suit you?" I agreed. And Ezra led me to a small cabin at the edge of the property. It was basic, just like he'd said, but it was clean and had a beautiful view of the creek. As Ezra was handing over the keys, he paused, a strange look crossing his face. "One more thing," he said, his voice lowered. "Watch out for the timber wolves." I frowned, confused. Wolves? I didn't know there were wolves in this area. Ezra's expression was unreadable. "Oh, there's wolves all right, just they ain't like any wolves you've ever seen before. You be careful out there, especially after dark." With that cryptic warning, he left me to settle in. I chalked it up to small-town superstition and started unpacking my meager belongings. The next few days passed in a peaceful blur. I spent most of my time by the creek, fishing rod in hand, enjoying the quiet and the clean air. It was a far cry from the noise and pollution of Rustville, and I could feel some of the tension that had been coiled in my chest for years starting to unwind. On my third day in Lost Creek, I met Dale Erickson. He was a burly guy, probably in his late 40s, with a thick beard and a booming laugh that seemed to shake the very trees. I was at my usual spot by the creek when he approached, carrying a cooler and his own fishing gear. "Mind if I join you?" he called out. The fish seemed to be biting well here. I waved him over, and soon we were swapping fishing stories and sharing the beers he'd brought along. Dale, it turned out, had been coming to Lost Creek every summer since he was a kid. "There's something special about this place," he said, his eyes scanning the tree line. "It gets under your skin, you know. Makes you forget about all the bullshit out there in the real world." I could relate to that. Already Rustville and all its associated pain seemed like a distant memory. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Dale's mood seemed to shift. He became quieter, more contemplative, his eyes darting to the deepening shadows between the trees. "You heard about the Night Stalker?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. I shook my head, a chill running down my spine despite the warm evening air. "Night Stalker?" Dale nodded, taking a long pull from his beer before continuing. "It's an old story around here. Some say it's just a tale to scare the tourists, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I've been coming here for 30 years, and I've seen things, heard things. There's something out there in those woods, Jack, something that ain't natural." I wanted to laugh it off, to tell Dale he'd had too much to drink, but the look in his eyes stopped me. This wasn't the ramblings of a drunk or the tall tales of a local trying to spook the newcomer. Dale believed what he was saying, and that scared me more than any campfire story could. "What kind of things?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Dale was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the darkening forest. "Tracks," he said finally. "Bigger than any animal I've ever seen. And the sounds. God, the sounds. Like something dying but angry about it. It echoes through the trees at night sometimes. Sends shivers down your spine." He turned to me then, his face deadly serious. "You be careful out here, Jack, especially at night. There's things in these woods that don't take kindly to strangers." With that ominous warning, Dale packed up his gear and headed back to town, leaving me alone with my thoughts in the encroaching darkness. That night, as I lay in my bed in Finnegan's cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The woods that had seemed so peaceful during the day now felt oppressive, full of watching eyes and hidden dangers. Just as I was starting to drift off to sleep, I heard it, a high-pitched shriek that cut through the night like a knife, setting my teeth on edge and sending my heart racing. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human, but filled with a primal rage that made my blood run cold. I sat up in bed, straining my ears in the darkness. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then, just as I was starting to convince myself I'd imagined it, the sound came again. Closer this time. I scrambled out of bed, my eyes scanning the darkness outside my window. The moon was full, casting an eerie light over the landscape, but I couldn't see anything moving in the trees. Sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. I sat by the window, a kitchen knife close at hand, jumping at every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted but relieved. I made my way to the local diner in desperate need of coffee and human contact. The place was busy, filled with the chatter of locals starting their day. I slid onto a stool at the counter, ordering a large coffee from a friendly waitress named Betty. As I sipped my coffee, trying to shake off the lingering unease from the night before, I overheard a conversation between two men a few seats down. "Telling you, Tom, I heard it again last night. Clear as day." "Oh, come on, Frank. You've been hearing that night stalker of yours for years. Ain't nothing out there but coyotes and your imagination." I perked up at the mention of the night stalker, Dale's warning fresh in my mind. The man called Frank shook his head vehemently. "It ain't coyotes, Tom. You know as well as I do that what's out there is something else entirely. My grandpappy used to tell stories about it, said it's been stalking these woods for generations." Tom rolled his eyes, but I could see a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. "Yeah, well, your grandpappy also used to say he saw little green men dancing in his cornfield. Don't mean it's true." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Brody, a young guy who looked like he'd be more at home on a college campus than wearing a badge. He nodded to the men at the counter, his eyes lingering on me for a moment before he took a seat. "Morning, Sheriff," Betty called out. "The usual?" Brody nodded, then turned to Frank and Tom. "You fellas talking about that noise again?" Frank nodded eagerly. "You heard it too, didn't you, Sheriff? Last night?" Brody's face was carefully neutral. "I heard something," he admitted. "Probably just a mountain lion or something, nothing to worry about." But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted around the diner as if checking to see who was listening. He didn't believe his own words any more than Frank did. As the days passed, I tried to put the incident out of my mind. I focused on fishing, on exploring the beautiful wilderness around Lost Creek, on getting to know the locals. But the memory of that shriek in the night, and the palpable fear it had inspired in me, lingered like a bad taste in my mouth. I saw Dale a few more times, always by the creek. He seemed jumpier than before, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. When I asked him about the night stalker, he clammed up, changing the subject with a forced laugh. It was about a week after that night when things took a turn for the worse. I was having breakfast at the diner when Sheriff Brody burst in, his face pale and drawn. "Has anyone seen Dale Erickson?" he asked, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. A hush fell over the diner. I felt my stomach drop. "Not since yesterday," Betty said slowly. "He was in for lunch, said he was going fishing up by Miller's Point." "Why? What's wrong?" Brody ran a hand through his hair, his composure slipping. "His truck was found abandoned up by the South Trail. His gear was scattered all over the place like something spooked him." The silence in the diner was deafening. I could almost hear the unspoken thought running through everyone's mind. The night stalker. A search party was organized, with what seemed like half the town volunteering to comb the woods for any sign of Dale. I joined them, my heart heavy with a mix of fear and guilt. If only I'd taken Dale's warnings more seriously. If only I'd insisted he not go out alone. We searched for 3 days, from dawn until well after dusk, but there was no sign of Dale. No tracks, no torn clothing, nothing. It was as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. On the evening of the third day, as we were about to call off the search, I heard it again, that bone-chilling shriek echoing through the trees. I wasn't the only one. I saw the color drain from Sheriff Brody's face, saw the way the other searchers huddled closer together, their eyes wide with fear. "It's just an animal," Brody said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Come on, let's head back to town. It's not safe out here after dark." No one argued with him. The mood in Lost Creek changed after that. The easygoing, friendly atmosphere was replaced by a palpable tension. People hurried through their daily tasks, casting nervous glances at the surrounding forest. The laughter and chatter that had once filled the diner was replaced by hushed conversations and worried looks. I found myself spending more and more time in my cabin, venturing out only during the day to fish or buy supplies. At night I'd lie awake, listening to the sounds of the forest, my heart racing at every unexpected noise. It was on one of these sleepless nights, about a week after Dale's disappearance, that I saw it for the first time. I was sitting by the window, a habit I'd developed since that first night, when movement at the edge of the forest caught my eye. At first I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on me, but then I saw it step into a patch of moonlight and my blood ran cold. It was massive, easily the size of a bear, but its proportions were all wrong. It moved on all fours, but its back legs were longer than its front, giving it an awkward, loping gait. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur that seemed to shift colors in the moonlight, blending seamlessly with the shadows around it. But it was the creature's face that truly terrified me. It had a long, wolf-like snout, but its jaw was distended, hanging open to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth. Its eyes glowed an eerie yellow in the darkness, filled with an intelligence that seemed almost human. For a moment our eyes met, and I felt a primal fear unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. This was the Night Stalker, the creature that had been haunting Lost Creek for generations. And now it was looking right at me. I don't know how long we stared at each other. It could have been seconds or hours. But eventually, the creature turned and loped back into the forest, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't sleep at all that night. When morning finally came, I practically ran to Sheriff Brody's office, my words tumbling out in a panicked rush as I tried to describe what I'd seen. To his credit, Brody listened patiently, his face growing more and more grave as I spoke. When I finished, he let out a long sigh. "You're not the first person to see it, you know," he said quietly. "My granddaddy used to tell stories about the Night Stalker, said it was some kind of curse on the town, a punishment for sins long forgotten. I always thought they were just stories, meant to keep kids from wandering into the woods at night. But now—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "We've got to do something. We can't just let this thing keep terrorizing our town." Over the next few days, a plan was formulated. A group of us, me, Sheriff Brody, Old Man Finnegan, and a few other townsfolk, would venture into the woods armed with rifles and whatever else we could think of that might be effective against the creature. The night we chose for our hunt was moonless, the forest pitch black beyond the reach of our flashlights. We moved slowly, every snapping twig and rustle of leaves setting our nerves on edge. We'd been searching for hours, the tension building with each passing minute, when we heard it. That same blood-curdling shriek that had haunted my dreams for weeks. It was close, too close. Everything happened so fast after that. The creature burst from the underbrush, a blur of fur and fangs. I caught a glimpse of yellow eyes, heard the boom of rifles and the panicked shouts of the men around me. In the chaos, I found myself separated from the group. I ran blindly through the woods, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. I could hear it behind me, its heavy breathing and the thud of its paws against the forest floor. I burst into a clearing and skidded to a stop, There, in the center of the open space, was an old gnarled tree. Its trunk was easily 10 feet across, its branches reaching up into the night sky like grasping fingers. Something about the tree called to me. Without really knowing why, I ran towards it. As I reached the base of the trunk, I saw a hollow, just big enough for a man to squeeze through. Without hesitation, I dove in. The inside of the tree was surprisingly spacious, and as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized I wasn't alone. Huddled in the corner, his clothes torn and dirty, was Dale. "Dale?" I whispered, hardly daring to believe my eyes. "Is that really you?" He looked up at me, his eyes wide with fear and something else. Recognition. "Jack?" he croaked, his voice hoarse from disuse. How did you find this place?" Before I could answer, we heard it. The creature was outside, its claws scraping against the bark of the tree. We held our breath, pressing ourselves against the inside of the trunk, praying it wouldn't find us. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Finally, we heard the creature move away, its heavy footsteps fading into the distance. When we were sure it was gone, Dale began to speak. He told me about the night he disappeared, how he'd been chased by the creature and found refuge in this very tree. He'd been too afraid to leave, surviving on rainwater that collected in the hollow and whatever small animals he could catch. But there was more to his story. As he spoke, I began to understand the true nature of the Night Stalker and the curse that had plagued Lost Creek for generations. The creature, Dale explained, was once a man, a settler who had come to this land centuries ago, greedy for the resources it held. He had made a deal with dark forces, gaining immortality and great power in exchange for serving as a guardian of the forest. But the power had corrupted him, twisting his body and mind until he became the monstrous creature we now knew as the Night Stalker. He was bound to the forest, unable to leave, forever caught between his human past and his bestial present. The curse could only be broken by an act of true sacrifice, someone willing to take the creature's place as guardian of the forest. As Dale spoke, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I knew what I had to do. When dawn broke, we emerged from the tree. The search party found us soon after, their cries of relief echoing through the forest. But their joy turned to confusion and fear when I explained what I was about to do. Despite their protests, I made my way back to the clearing with the ancient tree. There, bathed in the early morning light, stood the Night Stalker. Up close, I could see the vestiges of humanity in its eyes, the pain and loneliness of centuries of isolation. I stepped forward, my heart pounding but my resolve firm. "I'll take your place," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'll be the new guardian." For a moment nothing happened. Then the creature began to change. Its fur receded, its limbs straightened, and soon a man stood before me. He was old, impossibly old, his skin wrinkled and his hair white as snow. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracked and dry from centuries of disuse. Then he simply faded away, like mist in the morning sun. I felt the change begin immediately. Power surged through me, ancient and primal. I could feel every tree, every blade of grass, every creature in the forest. I was no longer just Jack Hawkins. I was the forest itself, its guardian and protector. As the transformation completed, I turned to look at Dale and the others one last time. I saw the mix of awe and sadness in their eyes, knew that they understood the sacrifice I had made. Then I turned and loped into the forest, my new home. The Night Stalker was gone, but the legend would live on, and I would be there watching over Lost Creek, protecting it from whatever dangers might come. In the years that followed, the town of Lost Creek changed. The fear that had gripped it for so long faded, replaced by a deep respect for the forest and its new guardian. Tourists came, drawn by the fishing and the beauty of the wilderness, but also by the whispered stories of the creature that protected the woods. And on quiet nights, when the moon is full and the wind whispers through the trees, The people of Lost Creek swear they can sometimes see a figure at the edge of the forest. Not monstrous, but not quite human either. A guardian watching over them all. As for me, I found the peace I'd been searching for when I first came to Lost Creek. It wasn't the life I'd imagined for myself, but it was a life with purpose, with meaning. And in the end, isn't that what we're all looking for? So if you ever find yourself in Lost Creek, enjoy the fishing, admire the scenery. But remember, the forest is alive, and it's watching. And somewhere out there, so am I. It was the summer of 1978, and I, Frank Thompson, was a fresh-faced 20-year-old with dreams as big as the Vermont mountains that surrounded Camp Birchwood Grove. Little did I know that this summer job would become the crucible that would forge the man I am today, some 46 years later. The drive up to Camp Birchwood Grove was a journey into another world. As my beat-up Chevy chugged along winding roads, the sprawling cityscape of Boston gave way to dense forests and rolling hills. The air grew crisp, filled with the scent of pine and possibility. I remember thinking, "This is it, Frank. Your big adventure begins now." Camp Birchwood Grove wasn't much to look at when I first arrived. A collection of weathered cabins clustered around a central lodge with a sparkling lake stretching out behind them. The place had character, though, decades of summers etched into every wooden plank and well-worn path. I wasn't the only new face that summer. There was Margot, a vivacious redhead from California with a laugh that could wake the dead. Dmitri, a soft-spoken exchange student from Ukraine who could play the violin like an angel. And Tyler, a lanky Texan with a drawl as thick as molasses and a heart of gold. Leading our motley crew was Hank, the head counselor, a barrel-chested man with a salt-and-pepper beard and eyes that had seen it all. Those first few days were a whirlwind of activity. We scrubbed cabins until our hands were raw, repaired rickety dock planks, and learned the ins and outs of keeping a bunch of rowdy kids entertained for 8 weeks. Nights were spent around the campfire, sharing stories and dreams, forming bonds that we thought would last a lifetime. It was on one of those nights that Hank told us about Old Man Erickson. "Boys and girls," he began, his voice low and gravelly, "every camp's got its ghost story, and Birchwood Grove is no exception." He went on to spin a tale about a Swedish immigrant who'd worked as the camp's caretaker back in the 30s. According to Hank, Erickson had gone mad one winter, convinced that the trees were whispering to him. He vanished into the forest, never to be seen again. We laughed it off, of course. Ghost stories were part and parcel of the camp experience, right? But I couldn't shake the chill that ran down my spine when Hank finished his tale, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames of our campfire. The first few weeks of camp were everything I'd hoped for and more. Days filled with laughter, canoe races on the lake, and the simple joy of watching kids discover the wonders of nature. Nights were a symphony of crickets and the soft lapping of waves on the shore, punctuated by the occasional hoot of an owl. It was during the 3rd week that things began to change. At first it was little things, a canoe paddle going missing here, a lantern there. We chalked it up to forgetful campers or maybe a raccoon with sticky fingers. But then food started disappearing from the kitchen in large quantities. Our cook, Mrs. Abernathy, was beside herself, convinced one of us counselors was playing a prank. One night I was on duty with Margot, making sure all the campers were in their bunks. We were walking back to the lodge when we heard it, a low, mournful sound coming from the woods. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite human, not quite animal. Margot grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What was that?" she whispered, her usual bravado nowhere to be found. I tried to play it cool, telling her it was probably just the wind or maybe a wounded animal, but deep down I felt a primal fear taking root. We reported the incident to Hank the next morning, but he brushed it off, saying the woods were full of strange noises at night. A few days later, during an afternoon hike, one of our youngest campers, a quiet boy named Jimmy, wandered off from the group. We spent hours searching for him, our calls echoing through the trees with increasing desperation. As dusk fell, we had no choice but to call in the local authorities. The next few days were a blur of police interviews, search parties, and terrified parents arriving to take their children home. Through it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the trees, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. It was Dimitri who found Jimmy's backpack. It was hanging from a tree branch deep in the woods, far off any trail. The police dogs went crazy when they caught the scent, but the trail went cold at the edge of a fast-moving stream. As the days wore on with no sign of Jimmy, the camp began to empty. Parents arrived in a steady stream to collect their children, many shooting accusing glares at us counselors. I couldn't blame them. We were supposed to keep their kids safe, and we had failed spectacularly. A week after Jimmy's disappearance, Margot didn't show up for breakfast. We searched the camp, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. It was Tyler who thought to check the boathouse. We found her there, huddled in a corner, her eyes wide with terror. "I saw him," she kept repeating, her voice barely above a whisper. "Old man Erickson. He was outside my cabin last night, just standing there watching." Hank tried to calm her down, saying she must have had a nightmare, but the fear in his eyes betrayed his words. That afternoon, Margot's parents came to take her home. As she left, she turned to me and said, "Be careful, Frank. This place, it's not right." With Margot gone and Jimmy still missing, the atmosphere at camp turned oppressive. The remaining campers were sent home, but we counselors stayed on, helping with the ongoing search and keeping the camp running. Nights were the worst. The once comforting sounds of the forest now seemed menacing, filled with whispers and movement just beyond the reach of our flashlights. It was on one of these nights that everything came to a head. I was having trouble sleeping and decided to take a walk down to the lake. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the water. As I stood on the dock, letting the cool night air calm my nerves, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned expecting to see one of my fellow counselors, but instead I found myself face to face with a stranger. He was tall and gaunt, with wild, unkempt hair and a beard that reached his chest. His clothes were tattered and dirty, as if he'd been living in the woods for years. But it was his eyes that truly terrified me. They were filled with a mixture of madness and malice that made my blood run cold. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice a raspy growl. "This is my place, my woods, my children." I stumbled backward, nearly falling off the dock in my haste to get away. The man and I knew in my heart that this was old man Erickson, impossible as it seemed, advanced on me, pulling a wicked-looking knife from his belt. I don't remember running back to the lodge, but suddenly I was there, pounding on doors, screaming for help. Hank was the first to respond, shotgun in hand. When I told him what I'd seen, his face went pale. "I was afraid of this," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I should have told you all the truth from the beginning." As the other counselors gathered in the lodge, Hank revealed the dark history of Camp Birchwood Grove. Old man Erickson hadn't just been a caretaker, he'd been the camp's founder. But over the years he'd grown possessive of the land and the children who came to stay each summer. In 1939, 3 campers had gone missing. Erickson was the prime suspect, but there was never enough evidence to charge him. He disappeared into the woods shortly after, and the camp was closed for years. When it reopened under new management in the 50s, Hank had been hired as a young counselor. He'd heard the stories but didn't believe them until now. As Hank finished his tale, a blood-curdling scream cut through the night. We raced outside to find Tyler on the ground, clutching his arm. Blood seeped between his fingers from a deep gash. "He was here," Tyler gasped. "Right outside the window. He tried to grab me." Hank made the call then and there. We were evacuating. As we piled into cars, headlights cutting through the darkness, I caught one last glimpse of a figure standing at the edge of the woods. Whether it was Old Man Erickson or just a trick of the light, I'll never know for sure. The aftermath of that summer was a nightmare of police investigations and painful questions. Jimmy's body was never found, despite extensive searches of the area. The camp was closed permanently, its dark history finally too much to overcome. For years I struggled with guilt and fear. Nightmares plagued my sleep, filled with twisted trees and the echoes of children's laughter. It took time and therapy, but eventually I learned to live with the memories of that summer. Now, as I sit here at 66, those events feel both distant and immediate. I've built a good life for myself, a loving family, a successful career. But there's always been a part of me that remains that terrified 20-year-old, standing on a moonlit dock, coming face to face with a madman. I've often wondered about the others, Margot, Dimitri, Tyler, and Hank. Did they manage to move on, or are they still haunted by the events of that summer? And what of Jimmy? Does his spirit still wander those woods, forever lost? There are some who say the land where Camp Birchwood Grove once stood is cursed, that the whispers of the trees drive men to madness. I don't know if I believe that, but I do know this. There are dark corners in this world where the line between reality and nightmare blurs, places where the past refuses to stay buried, and old sins cast long shadows. As for me, I've never returned to those Vermont woods. But sometimes on quiet nights when the wind rustles through the trees outside my window, I find myself transported back to that summer. And in those moments I swear I can hear the ghostly laughter of children carried on the breeze, a chilling reminder that some campfire stories are more than just tales meant to scare. Sometimes they're warnings we should have heeded. My name is Alex Thornton, and this story begins 5 years ago when I was 23, young, naive, and hungry for adventure. Back then, life seemed like an endless buffet of possibilities, each day a new dish waiting to be sampled. I was a city kid through and through, raised in the concrete jungle of Chicago, more accustomed to the rumble of the L train than the whisper of wind through canyon walls. It was early June when my old college roommate, Finn O'Brien, called me up out of the blue. Finn was the kind of guy who always had a scheme brewing, the type who'd convince you to skip class for an impromptu road trip and somehow make you feel like it was your idea all along. "Alex, my man," his voice crackled through the phone, brimming with that infectious enthusiasm I knew all too well. "How do you feel about the greatest adventure of your life?" I chuckled, already half convinced despite my better judgment. "All right, Finn, what's the pitch this time?" 2 words, Canyonlands National Park. "That's 3 words, I pointed out, unable to resist. Details, details," Finn laughed. "Listen, I just scored this sweet RV from my uncle. She's a bit rough around the edges, but she runs. I'm thinking we take her on a grand tour of the Southwest. Deserts, canyons, stars like you wouldn't believe. What do you say?" I hesitated. The idea of trading my comfortable apartment for a cramped RV and the great unknown wasn't exactly appealing. "I don't know, Finn. Camping's not really my thing. I'm more of a hot shower and room service kind of traveler." "Come on, Alex. When was the last time you did something spontaneous, something that scared you a little?" Finn's voice took on that persuasive tone I knew all too well. This is our chance to see a part of the country most people only dream about, to have stories we'll tell our grandkids someday. I sighed, feeling my resolve crumble. "You're going to keep bugging me until I say yes, aren't you?" You know me so well, Finn chuckled. Pack your bags, buddy. We leave in 3 days. And just like that, I found myself agreeing to a cross-country camping trip in a ramshackle RV with my adventure junkie best friend. Little did I know that this journey would change my life in ways I could never have imagined. 3 days later, I stood on the curb outside my apartment building, a duffel bag at my feet, and a mix of excitement and trepidation churning in my stomach. The rumble of an engine announced Finn's arrival before I saw him. The RV that rounded the corner was a sight to behold. A 1985 Winnebago Chieftain, its once white exterior now a patchwork of rust and faded paint. Finn called her Rosie, though Rusty seemed more appropriate. Finn's grinning face appeared in the driver's window. Your chariot awaits, good sir. I tossed my bag into the RV and climbed aboard, immediately hit by the musty smell of aged upholstery and the faint aroma of something I couldn't quite place. The interior was a time capsule from the 80s, faux wood paneling, garish floral curtains, and a kitchenette that had seen better days. She's something, I managed, trying to keep the doubt from my voice. Isn't she? Finn beamed, oblivious to my hesitation. We're going to have the time of our lives in this baby. Next stop, Canyonlands. As we pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the familiar skyline of Chicago, I felt a mix of emotions wash over me. Part of me was excited for the adventure ahead, while another part wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. Our journey west was a blur of highway diners, questionable gas station bathrooms, and endless stretches of cornfields giving way to prairies. Finn regaled me with tales of the wonders awaiting us in Utah. Towering red rock formations, winding rivers carving through ancient stone, and night skies so clear you could see the Milky Way with your naked eye. We crossed into Colorado on our 3rd day, the landscape changing dramatically as the Rocky Mountains loomed on the horizon. The flat monotony of the Great Plains gave way to rugged peaks and winding mountain roads. Rosie struggled with the elevation, her engine protesting as we climbed higher and higher. Come on, old girl, Finn coaxed, patting the dashboard affectionately. You can do it. As we descended into western Colorado, the scenery shifted again. Red rock mesas and deep canyons hinted at the wonders that awaited us in Utah. We spent that night at a small campground just outside Grand Junction, our first real taste of camping on this trip. I'll admit that first night under the stars was magical. Away from the light pollution of the city, the night sky was a tapestry of stars, more than I'd ever seen in my life. Finn and I sat by a small campfire, sharing a beer and marveling at the vastness above us. See, Finn said, gesturing at the sky. This is what I'm talking about. You can't get this in Chicago. I had to agree. Despite the discomfort of sleeping in the cramped RV, despite the lack of modern amenities, there was something soul-stirring about being out here in the wilderness. Little did I know this was just the beginning. The real adventure and the terror that came with it was still waiting for us in the heart of Canyonlands. We crossed into Utah the next day, the landscape growing increasingly otherworldly with each passing mile. Massive sandstone formations jutted from the earth like the bones of ancient giants, their red and orange hues shifting with the changing light. Finn's excitement was palpable as we neared Moab, the gateway to Canyonlands National Park. We're almost there, Alex. He grinned, his eyes flickering between the road and the towering mesas in the distance. Can you believe this place? It's like we've landed on Mars. I had to admit, the scenery was breathtaking. As a city kid, I'd never seen anything quite like it. The vastness of the landscape, the alien rock formations, the deep blue sky stretching endlessly overhead. It was simultaneously beautiful and intimidating. We rolled into the visitor center parking lot late in the afternoon. While Finn chatted up a park ranger about trail conditions and campsite availability, I browsed the gift shop, picking up a detailed topographic map of the park. Something about being in this wild place made me want to be prepared. "Change of plans," Finn announced as he bounded back to the RV. His eyes were gleaming with that look I knew all too well, the one that usually preceded his craziest ideas. "I've got something way better than the regular tourist spots." I felt a twinge of unease. "What do you mean?" Finn pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, smoothing it against the RV's hood. It was a crudely drawn map, the kind you'd expect to see in a treasure hunting movie. "The ranger told me about this place called Echo Canyon. It's way off the beaten path, not even on most maps. Supposed to be one of the most beautiful and secluded spots in the whole park." I frowned, studying the map I'd just bought. "I don't see any Echo Canyon on here." "Exactly," Finn's grin widened. "That's what makes it special. Come on, Alex, where's your sense of adventure?" Against my better judgment, I found myself nodding. "All right, but if we get lost out there, I'm blaming you." We stocked up on supplies in Moab, extra water, food, a first aid kit, and a satellite phone, my insistence much to Finn's amusement. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, we set off into the park, following Finn's hand-drawn map. The paved road soon gave way to rough dirt tracks. Rosie groaned and shuddered as we navigated the increasingly rugged terrain. The landmarks on Finn's map were vague at best. Big rock shaped like a shoe, cactus that looks like it's waving. And more than once I was sure we were hopelessly lost. As twilight settled over the canyonlands, transforming the red rocks into deep purples and blues, we finally found what we were looking for, or so Finn claimed. A narrow slot canyon opened up before us, its walls rising hundreds of feet on either side. "This has to be it," Finn exclaimed, bringing Rosie to a stop on a small, flat area just outside the canyon's mouth. "Echo Canyon, here we are." I peered out the window, a sense of unease settling in my stomach. The canyon was beautiful, yes, but also foreboding. The deepening shadows seemed to hold secrets, and the silence was absolute in a way I'd never experienced before. "Are you sure about this, Finn?" I asked as we began setting up camp. "We're pretty far from any help if something goes wrong." Finn clapped me on the shoulder, his enthusiasm undimmed. "Relax, buddy. This is what we came for. Adventure, solitude, nature, and all its raw beauty. Trust me, this is going to be amazing." As we finished setting up our campsite and the last light faded from the sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, my city-bred mind unused to the vast emptiness of the desert. But as I climbed into my sleeping bag that night, I couldn't help but wonder what mysteries and what dangers might be lurking in the depths of Echo Canyon. Sleep didn't come easy that first night in Echo Canyon. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the sparse vegetation and the soft snoring of Finn in his sleeping bag. I lay awake, staring at the canvas roof of our tent, my mind racing with thoughts of what might be out there in the darkness. It must have been close to midnight when I first noticed it. A faint, pulsing light on the ridge overlooking our campsite. At first I thought it might be a star, unusually bright in the clear desert air. But as I watched, I realized it was too large, too close to be a celestial body. I propped myself up on my elbows, squinting into the darkness. The light seemed to throb with a strange internal energy, casting an eerie glow over the surrounding rocks. It was mesmerizing and terrifying all at once. "Finn," I whispered, reaching out to shake my friend awake. "Finn, wake up, you need to see this." Finn grumbled, rolling over in his sleeping bag. "What is it, Alex? It's the middle of the night." "There's something on the ridge," I hissed, my eyes never leaving the pulsing light. "Some kind of, I don't know, a light or something." Finally rousing himself, Finn sat up and followed my gaze. His eyes widened as he spotted the phenomenon. "Whoa, what the hell is that?" "I don't know," I replied, a chill running down my spine despite the warm night air. "But it's giving me the creeps. Maybe we should pack up and get out of here." Finn, however, was already unzipping the tent, his face alight with curiosity. "Are you kidding? This is incredible. We have to check it out." "Finn, wait," I called, but he was already outside, fumbling for his flashlight. Reluctantly, I followed him out of the tent. The night air was cool on my skin, carrying the scent of sage and dust. The strange light on the ridge seemed even more prominent now, its pulsing rhythm almost hypnotic. "It's probably just some kind of natural phenomenon," Finn said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Maybe bioluminescent rocks or something?" I was about to reply when another sensation hit me, a low, thrumming vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like a feeling in my bones, setting my teeth on edge. "Do you feel that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Finn nodded, his excitement giving way to unease. "Yeah, what the hell is going on here?" As if in answer to his question, a new sound cut through the night. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, crunching on the gravelly soil. They seemed to be coming from the direction of the canyon, moving slowly but steadily towards our camp. Panic seized me. I grabbed Finn's arm, ready to drag him back to the relative safety of the RV. But before we could move, a figure emerged from the shadows of the canyon wall. In the dim starlight, I could make out a tall, impossibly thin silhouette. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its long limbs swaying slightly as it approached. My breath caught in my throat as it stepped into the pool of light cast by Finn's flashlight. It wasn't human. It couldn't be human. The creature before us stood at least 8 feet tall, its body a pale, almost translucent gray. Its limbs were elongated and jointed in ways that defied human anatomy. But it was the face that sent pure, primal terror coursing through my veins. Where eyes should have been, there were only deep, dark sockets that seemed to swallow the flashlight's beam. Its mouth was a jagged slash across its lower face, lined with needle-like teeth. As we watched, frozen in horror, that mouth stretched into a grotesque approximation of a smile. Finn's flashlight clattered to the ground as he stumbled backward. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The creature took another step towards us, its head cocking to one side in an almost curious gesture. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. One moment it was there, looming over us, and the next, it had vanished into the shadows, as if it had never existed. The pulsing light on the ridge blinked out. The thrumming vibration ceased. The night was once again silent and still. Finn and I stood there shaking for what felt like hours. Neither of us could speak, could barely even look at each other. When we finally managed to move, it was with the frantic energy of pure fear. We threw our belongings haphazardly into Rosie, not even bothering to break down the tent properly. As Finn gunned the engine and we lurched away from our campsite, I caught one last glimpse of Echo Canyon in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw that tall, thin silhouette standing at the mouth of the canyon, watching us go. But then we rounded a bend and the view was lost. We drove through the night, not stopping until we reached the relative civilization of Moab. Neither of us spoke about what we'd seen. I don't think we could have found the words if we'd tried. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky when we pulled into a truck stop on the outskirts of Moab. Finn cut the engine and we sat there in silence, the events of the night replaying in our minds. "What?" Finn finally managed, his voice hoarse. "What the hell was that, Alex?" I shook my head, still struggling to process what we'd experienced. "I don't know, I can't." We lapsed back into silence, the cheerful chatter of early morning patrons in the truck, stop diner a surreal counterpoint to the horror we'd just lived through. "Maybe we imagined it," Finn said after a while, but his tone lacked conviction. "Sleep deprivation, you know. The mind plays tricks." But we both knew that wasn't true. The image of that creature was burned into my memory, its impossible height, those bottomless eye sockets, that twisted grin. No hallucination could have been so vivid, so utterly terrifying. We spent the day in a daze, going through the motions of normality. We showered at the truck stop, ate a greasy breakfast that neither of us tasted, and tried to decide what to do next. "We should report it," I said finally, breaking the heavy silence that had fallen between us. "The park rangers, the police. Someone needs to know what's out there." Finn looked at me, his usually bright eyes now dull with exhaustion and lingering fear. "And tell them what exactly? That we saw some kind of monster? They'll think we're crazy or on drugs or both." He had a point. Even now, in the harsh light of day, our experience seemed too fantastical to be believed. Who would take us seriously? "Then what do we do?" I asked, feeling helpless. Finn ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "We go home, we try to forget." But forgetting, as it turned out, was easier said than done. The journey back to Chicago was a stark contrast to our excited departure just days earlier. Rosie's engine hummed steadily as we put mile after mile between us and Echo Canyon, but the tension inside the RV was palpable. We drove in shifts, neither of us wanting to stop for longer than absolutely necessary. When we did sleep, it was fitful, plagued by nightmares of long limbs and jagged smiles emerging from the darkness. Somewhere in Nebraska, Finn finally broke our unspoken agreement not to discuss what had happened. "Do you think it was real?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the road noise. I kept my eyes on the endless stretch of highway before us. "I don't know, it felt real, too real." "But it couldn't have been, right?" Finn pressed. "I mean, things like that. They don't exist, they can't." I wished I could agree with him, could dismiss our shared experience as some sort of mass hallucination. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature, felt the bone-deep vibration of its presence. "Maybe," I said, not believing it for a second. "Maybe it wasn't real." We lapsed back into silence, the weight of the unspoken hanging between us. Life in Chicago should have been a return to normalcy, a refuge from the terror we'd experienced in the desert. But the city that had once felt like home now seemed alien and confining. The constant noise, the press of people, the towering buildings, all of it grated on nerves still raw from our encounter. Finn and I drifted apart in the weeks that followed. We'd make plans to meet up, to talk, but one or the other of us would always find an excuse to cancel. It was easier that way, easier than facing the reality of what we'd been through together. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects and working long hours. Anything to keep my mind occupied, to stave off the memories that threatened to overwhelm me in quiet moments. But no matter how hard I tried to forget, Echo Canyon haunted me. I'd wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced I could hear that low, thrumming vibration. I'd catch glimpses of impossibly tall, thin figures in crowds, only to blink and find them gone. 3 months after our return, I received a package from Finn. Inside was the map he'd used to guide us to Echo Canyon, along with a short note. "Alex, I can't shake it. I've tried, but I can't. I'm going back. I need to know the truth. Don't try to stop me. Finn." My blood ran cold as I read his words. I tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. His apartment was empty, his car gone from its usual spot. For days I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to forget I'd ever received Finn's note, to continue my attempts at a normal life. But I knew I couldn't abandon my friend, couldn't let him face whatever was in Echo Canyon alone. With a heavy heart and a sense of impending doom, I packed a bag, quit my job, and set out for Utah once more. The drive to Canyonlands was a blur of anxiety and dread. I pushed myself to the limit, stopping only when absolutely necessary, my mind racing with possibilities of what I might find. As I neared Moab, I began asking around, showing Finn's picture to anyone who would look. Most people shook their heads, but a gas station attendant on the outskirts of town remembered him. Yeah, that guy came through here about a week ago, he said, squinting at the photo. Looked pretty rough, if you ask me. Kept talking about some canyon, asking if anyone had seen any strange lights. My heart sank. Did he say where he was going? The attendant shrugged. Headed out towards the park, I reckon. Didn't see him come back through. Armed with this information and a growing sense of urgency, I made my way into Canyonlands. The familiar landscape sent shivers down my spine, memories of our previous visit flooding back with each passing mile. I found Finn's car abandoned at a remote trailhead, a fine layer of red dust coating its surface. There was no sign of my friend, but a quick search of the vehicle turned up his journal. The last entry chilled me to the bone. I'm close, I can feel it. The vibrations are stronger here. The lights, they're calling to me. I have to know, I have to understand. With trembling hands, I gathered what supplies I could and set out on foot, following the crude map that had led us to Echo Canyon months before. The sun was setting by the time I reached the mouth of the canyon, painting the rocks in shades of deep crimson and purple. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of my boots on gravel and my own ragged breathing. "Finn," I called, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Finn, are you here?" There was no response, save for the mocking return of my own voice. As darkness fell, I set up a small camp, my every movement feeling watched, judged. I fought the urge to run, to abandon this fool's errand and return to the safety of civilization. But the thought of Finn, alone and possibly in danger, kept me rooted to the spot. It was nearing midnight when I saw it, the pulsing light on the ridge, just as before. My heart raced, every instinct screaming at me to flee, but I had come too far to turn back now. With shaking hands, I grabbed my flashlight and began to climb. The ascent was treacherous, loose rocks skittering away under my feet, sharp edges cutting into my palms as I scrambled upwards. The pulsing light grew brighter as I neared the top, its rhythm seeming to synchronize with my pounding heart. As I crested the ridge, the source of the light came into view. It wasn't what I had expected, no alien technology, no supernatural phenomenon. Instead, I found a crude circle of rocks, at its center a fire pit filled with glowing embers. Scattered around were empty cans, food wrappers, and— "Finn?" I called, spotting a huddled form at the edge of the circle. The figure stirred, turning towards me. Relief flooded through me as I recognized my friend's face, gaunt and unshaven but blessedly human. "Alex?" Finn's voice was hoarse, disbelieving. "What are you doing here?" I rushed to his side, noting with concern how thin he'd become, how his eyes seemed to have sunken into his skull. "I came to find you, you idiot. What were you thinking, coming back here alone?" Finn's laugh was bitter, edged with hysteria. "I had to know, Alex. I had to understand." "Understand what?" I asked, though a part of me dreaded the answer. Finn gestured around the circle. "All of this. The lights, the vibrations, the creature. I figured it out, Alex. I know what's really going on." I listened in growing disbelief as Finn explained his theory. The pulsing lights were nothing more than the embers of his fire, reflecting off the canyon walls in complex patterns. The vibrations? A combination of wind through the rock formations and the natural resonance of the canyon itself. "But what about the creature?" I asked. "We both saw it, Finn. It was real." Finn's eyes took on a manic gleam. "That's the beauty of it, Alex. It was real. To us. This place, there's something about it. The isolation, the silence, the way sound and light play tricks. It gets inside your head, makes you see things, believe things." I shook my head, unwilling to accept his explanation. No, it was too vivid, too. "Think about it," Finn interrupted. "Why hasn't anyone else ever reported seeing it? Why isn't this place crawling with cryptid hunters and paranormal researchers? Because it's all in our minds, Alex. We created the monster." As much as I wanted to argue, to cling to the belief that what we'd experienced was something external, something tangible, I felt the truth of Finn's words settling over me. The human mind, faced with the vastness and alienness of this place, had conjured up a manifestation of our deepest fears. We spent the rest of the night talking, piecing together the reality of what had happened months ago and in the intervening time. As the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The mystery was solved, the monster vanquished, not by bravery or force, but by understanding. Finn and I made our way back to civilization that morning, leaving behind the embers of his fire and the remnants of a mystery that had consumed us both. The return journey was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts, coming to terms with the truth we'd discovered. As we neared Moab, Finn broke the silence. What do we do now? I considered the question for a long moment. We live, I guess. We take what we've learned and we move forward. Finn nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Yeah, I like that. We parted ways in Moab, Finn heading west to start a new life in California, while I turned Rosie eastward, back towards Chicago. But as I drove, I realized that I wasn't the same person who had left the city months before. The experience had changed me, opened my eyes to the power of the human mind and the untamed beauty of the natural world. I found myself taking detours, exploring small towns and natural wonders I would have passed by without a second glance before. The journey that had started as a nightmare had transformed into something else, an awakening, a rediscovery of the world and my place in it. As I finally crossed the city limits of Chicago, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The urban landscape that had once seemed confining now held the promise of new adventures, new understandings. Echo Canyon and its mysteries would always be a part of me, a reminder of the thin line between reality and imagination, and the profound impact our perceptions have on the world around us. I parked Rosie on my street, patting her worn dashboard affectionately. "Thanks for the ride, old girl," I murmured. As I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the city bustling around me, I took a deep breath. The future stretched out before me, as vast and full of potential as the desert landscapes I'd left behind. Whatever came next, I was ready for it. Eyes open, mind clear, and heart full of the whispers of canyon lands. It was the summer of 1997 when everything changed. A summer that etched itself into my memory with the permanence of a scar, leaving behind a story I've struggled to tell for years. My name is Ethan Sawyer, and I've always been more at home among towering pines and babbling brooks than in the chaos of city streets. Growing up in the small town of Millbrook, nestled in the heart of the Adirondack Mountains, I learned early on that nature was my sanctuary. From the time I could walk, I'd spend every free moment exploring the vast wilderness that surrounded our little town. My father, a park ranger, instilled in me a deep respect for the outdoors, teaching me how to track animals, start a fire, and navigate using nothing but the stars. Those were happy times, filled with the simple joys of discovery and the warmth of family. But life has a way of upending even the most idyllic childhoods. When I was 12, my father disappeared during a routine patrol. They searched for weeks, but all they ever found was his abandoned truck at a trailhead deep in the mountains. My mother, consumed by grief and unanswered questions, threw herself into work, leaving me to navigate the treacherous waters of adolescence largely on my own. As I grew older, my connection to the wilderness only deepened. It became my escape, my therapy, my way of feeling close to the father I'd lost. By the time I hit my 30s, I'd built a life for myself in Millbrook. I worked as a freelance writer, churning out articles about outdoor adventures and conservation for various magazines. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and allowed me the freedom to disappear into the woods whenever the mood struck. Which brings me to that fateful summer of '97. I'd been feeling restless, burnt out from too many deadlines and not enough time among the trees. The walls of my small apartment seemed to close in a little more each day, and I knew I needed to get away. Not just for a weekend, but for a real, honest-to-God escape. I called my editor, told her I was taking a 2-week sabbatical, and started packing my gear. My roommate Jake, a burly firefighter with a penchant for bad jokes and good whiskey, watched me from the doorway of my room. "Another one of your wilderness vision quests?" he asked, taking a swig from his ever-present coffee mug. I grinned as I stuffed my sleeping bag into its compression sack. "Something like that. I need to clear my head, get back to basics." Jake nodded, his expression growing serious. "Just be careful out there, man. You remember what happened to old man Thompson last year?" I did remember. Thompson had gone out for a day hike and never returned. They found his body 3 weeks later at the bottom of a ravine. A stark reminder that even for those who knew the wilderness well, it could still be unforgiving. "I'll be fine," I assured him, zipping up my backpack. "I've got my satellite phone and I'll check in every couple of days. Besides, I'm not going anywhere too remote, just up to Shadow Creek. It's beautiful this time of year." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Shadow Creek? Isn't that where all those weird stories come from? The ones about strange lights and people going missing?" I laughed, brushing off his concern. "Those are just campfire tales, Jake. Probably started by some bored teenagers or overzealous cryptozoologists. Trust me, the scariest thing I'll encounter up there is a particularly aggressive mosquito. If only I'd known then how wrong I was. If only I'd listened to that small voice in the back of my mind that whispered caution. But I didn't. Instead, I finished packing, said my goodbyes to Jake, and headed out into the gathering twilight, my old Jeep loaded down with enough supplies to last me 2 weeks in the wilderness. As I drove out of Millbrook, the familiar buildings gave way to dense forest. The road wound higher into the mountains, civilization falling away with each passing mile. I rolled down the windows, breathing in the crisp mountain air, feeling the tension of the past few months begin to melt away. By the time I reached the trailhead for Shadow Creek, night had fully fallen. I could have made camp there at the small clearing near the parking area, but the idea of being so close to my car felt like cheating. No, I wanted to really immerse myself in nature, to put some distance between myself and the last vestiges of the modern world. So I shouldered my heavy pack, clicked on my headlamp, and set off down the trail. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow path that snaked between towering pines. The night was alive with sound, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through the trees. I hiked for about 2 hours, the weight of my pack and the steep terrain making the going slow. But I didn't mind. With each step I felt myself shedding the stress and worry I'd carried with me from town. Out here, deadlines and bills and the complexities of human interaction seemed far away and unimportant. Finally, I reached a small clearing near a bend in Shadow Creek. The sound of rushing water filled the air, a soothing white noise that promised to lull me to sleep. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and soon had a cheerful blaze going. As I sat by the fire eating a simple meal of dehydrated stew, I gazed up at the star-filled sky. Out here, away from light pollution, the Milky Way stretched across the heavens in all its glory. I thought about my father, wondering if he'd camped in this very spot during his patrols. The familiar ache of his absence throbbed in my chest, but it was tempered by a sense of connection. Somehow, being out here in the wilderness he'd loved so much made me feel closer to him. Little did I know, as I drifted off to sleep that night, that I was about to embark on an adventure that would challenge everything I thought I knew about myself, about nature, and about the thin line between reality and nightmare. I woke the next morning to the sound of bird song and the gentle gurgle of the creek. For a moment I lay in my sleeping bag, savoring the simple pleasure of waking up in the wilderness. No alarm clock, no traffic noise, no responsibilities beyond the basic needs of survival. After a breakfast of instant oatmeal and strong coffee, I spent the day exploring the area around my campsite. Shadow Creek lived up to its name, running cool and clear through a landscape of towering pines and moss-covered boulders. I hiked upstream, scrambling over rocks and pushing through dense underbrush. About a mile from my camp, I came across a series of small waterfalls cascading down a rocky slope. The spot was breathtakingly beautiful, with ferns and wildflowers clinging to the damp rocks. I spent an hour there, sketching in my notebook and simply soaking in the peacefulness of the place. It wasn't until I was making my way back to camp that I noticed something odd. At first it was just a feeling, a prickle on the back of my neck like I was being watched. I paused, scanning the woods around me, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the feeling persisted. As I neared my campsite, I spotted something that made me freeze in my tracks. There, in a patch of soft earth near the creek, was a footprint, a human footprint. Now, finding evidence of other hikers isn't usually cause for alarm, but this was different. The print was large, much larger than my own boot, and it looked off somehow. The toes were splayed wide, and the shape of the foot seemed elongated, almost inhuman. I crouched down to examine it more closely, my heart pounding. That's when I noticed the second strange thing. The print was fresh, the edges still sharp and clear. Someone or something had been here very recently. I looked around, suddenly acutely aware of how isolated I was. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the vastness of the forest. "Is anyone there?" Only the whisper of wind through the trees and the babble of the creek answered me. I hurried back to my campsite, checking over my shoulder every few steps. Everything looked untouched. My tent was still standing, my supplies undisturbed, but the feeling of unease lingered. That night, as I sat by my fire, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being observed. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I told myself I was being silly, that my imagination was running wild. After all, wasn't this why I'd come out here? To get away from people? So what if someone else was camping nearby? But as the fire burned low and the shadows lengthened, that rational voice grew quieter. I found myself thinking of all the stories Jake had mentioned, the strange lights, the disappearances. I had dismissed them as campfire tales, but now, alone in the dark wilderness, they seemed far more plausible. I slept fitfully that night, waking at every sound. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I jerked awake, my heart racing. I could have sworn I'd heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, circling my tent. I lay there barely breathing, straining my ears, but all I heard was the normal nighttime sounds of the forest. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from my tent, half expecting to find my camp ransacked or more mysterious footprints. But everything was as I'd left it. I shook my head, chiding myself for letting my imagination run wild. I was out here to relax, not to conjure up boogeymen from the shadows. I spent the day fishing in the creek, catching a couple of nice trout which I cooked over the fire for dinner. The peaceful activity and the satisfaction of providing my own meal went a long way toward settling my nerves. By the time night fell again, I'd almost convinced myself that the footprint had been nothing more than a trick of the light, a natural formation that my tired mind had transformed into something sinister, almost. As I banked the fire for the night, I found myself glancing into the darkness beyond the circle of firelight more often than I'd like to admit. And when I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I made sure my hunting knife was within easy reach, just in case. The next few days passed without incident. I fell into a comfortable routine, waking with the sun, spending my days hiking, fishing, and writing in my journal. The initial unease faded, replaced by the deep sense of contentment that always came over me in the wilderness. I began to think that maybe I had overreacted to the footprint, that my city-softened mind had conjured up a mystery where none existed. It was on the fifth night that everything changed. I had spent the day on a long hike, pushing further up the creek than I'd gone before. The terrain had grown rougher, the forest denser. By the time I made it back to camp, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. Tired but satisfied, I got a fire going and set about preparing my dinner, the last of the trout I'd caught, along with some foraged berries and greens. As I ate, I watched the stars come out, marveling as always at how bright they were out here, away from the light pollution of civilization. It must have been around midnight when I decided to turn in. I was just about to douse the fire when I heard it, a long, low howl that echoed through the trees. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. It wasn't a wolf. I'd heard wolf howls before, and this was different. It was deeper, more guttural, and there was an almost human quality to it that sent shivers down my spine. I scrambled for my flashlight, flicking it on and scanning the tree line. The beam seemed pitifully small against the vast darkness of the forest. "Hello?" I called out, hating how my voice shook. "Is someone there?" Silence. Even the normal nighttime sounds of the forest had gone quiet, as if every creature was holding its breath. And then I saw it. Just at the edge of my flashlight's beam, a figure stepped out from behind a tree. My first wild thought was that it was a bear, standing on its hind legs. But as it moved closer, I realized with dawning horror that it was bipedal, vaguely human in shape, but wrong. It was tall, easily 7 feet, with long arms that hung almost to its knees. Its body was covered in what looked like matted fur, dark and unkempt. But it was the face that truly chilled me to my core. It was a twisted parody of a human face, with a heavy brow, a wide lipless mouth, and eyes that reflected the light of my flashlight like an animal's. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination, a vivid nightmare. But the creature took another step forward, and I caught a whiff of its scent, a pungent, musky odor that made my nose wrinkle. That broke the spell of my paralysis. I scrambled backwards, nearly falling over my own feet in my haste. "Stay back!" I yelled, my voice cracking with fear. The creature cocked its head to one side, regarding me with what seemed like curiosity. Then it opened its mouth and let out another of those howls, a sound that seemed to reverberate through my very bones. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and ran, abandoning my camp, my supplies, everything. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I had no idea where I was going. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me moving. Finally, I stumbled into a small clearing and collapsed, gasping for breath. As I lay there trying to quiet my ragged breathing, I strained my ears for any sound of pursuit. But there was nothing. No howls, no crashing through the underbrush, just the normal sounds of the forest at night. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself to my feet. My flashlight was gone, lost somewhere in my mad flight. The moon provided just enough light to see by, but every shadow seemed to hide a threat. I was lost, weaponless, with no supplies and no idea which direction would lead me back to civilization. For the first time, the full gravity of my situation hit me. I was alone in the wilderness, being hunted by something that shouldn't exist, and no one knew where I was. As the adrenaline faded, exhaustion set in. I knew I couldn't keep running blindly through the forest. I was more likely to break an ankle or fall off a cliff than to find my way to safety. I needed to find shelter, to rest and try to think clearly. I spotted a large fallen tree, its upturned roots creating a small cave-like space. It wasn't much, but it was better than being out in the open. I crawled into the space, curling up as small as I could make myself. As I lay there, shivering in the cool night air, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. It couldn't have been real. Maybe I'd eaten some bad berries, or the isolation was making me hallucinate, but deep down, I knew the truth. What I'd seen was real, no matter how impossible it seemed. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, weak morning light was filtering through the roots of my makeshift shelter. For a moment I was disoriented, wondering why I was curled up under a fallen tree instead of in my tent. Then the memories of the night before came flooding back, and I had to bite back a groan of fear and despair. It hadn't been a nightmare. I was really lost in the wilderness, being stalked by something. I crawled out from under the tree, my body protesting every movement. I was covered in scratches from my headlong flight through the forest, and every muscle ached. But I was alive, and in the light of day, that seemed like a victory in itself. Now I had to figure out how to stay that way. The first order of business was to figure out where I was and how to get back to civilization. I climbed to the top of a small rise, hoping to get my bearings. The landscape that greeted me was disheartening, miles of unbroken forest in every direction, with no sign of roads, buildings, or anything man-made. I closed my eyes, trying to remember my father's lessons on wilderness navigation. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west, his voice echoed in my memory. If you can find north, you can find your way. It was mid-morning, so the sun was still in the eastern part of the sky. That meant that my shadow pointed roughly west. I knew that the trailhead where I'd left my Jeep was southeast of my original campsite. But how far had I run in my panic last night? With no better option, I decided to head southeast, hoping to either find my camp or intersect the trail. As I walked, I tried to focus on immediate survival needs rather than dwelling on what I'd seen the night before. I was thirsty, hungry, and vulnerable without any gear. Water was my first priority. I listened for the sound of running water and soon found a small stream. I was tempted to drink directly from it, but my outdoor training kicked in. Giardia and other waterborne illnesses were a real risk. Instead, I looked around for materials to make a fire. It took time, but I managed to get a small blaze going using friction and some dry tinder. I found a discarded beer can in a hollow, a disheartening reminder that even this remote wilderness wasn't untouched by human carelessness, but a godsend in my current situation. I used it to boil water from the stream, making it safe to drink. Food was trickier. I hadn't paid much attention to edible plants during my previous hikes, a negligence I now regretted bitterly. I recognized some blackberry bushes and feasted on the ripe berries, but I knew they wouldn't provide enough sustenance for long. As I foraged and walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. The rational part of my mind insisted that what I'd seen last night was impossible, a product of fear and imagination. But the memory of that creature's eyes reflecting my flashlight beam, the musky scent of its fur, felt too real to dismiss. Night was approaching again, and I knew I needed to find shelter. The thought of spending another night exposed in the forest, especially knowing what might be out there, filled me with dread. I quickened my pace, searching for anywhere that might offer some protection. Just as the light was fading, I stumbled upon an old hunter's cabin. It was little more than a shack, really, with gaps in the walls and a roof that had partially caved in. But it was the first sign of human presence I'd seen all day, and it felt like salvation. I approached cautiously, alert for any signs of recent occupation, human or otherwise. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, disturbing a thick layer of dust. It was clear no one had been here in years. The cabin was sparsely furnished with a rusty cot, a small table, and a pot-bellied stove. Best of all, there was a shelf stocked with a few canned goods. They were well past their expiration date. but in my current situation, they looked like a gourmet meal. I used my pocket knife to open a can of beans, wolfing them down cold. As I ate, I took stock of my situation. I had shelter, a source of food, and there was a stream nearby for water. If I could just hold out for a few days, surely someone would come looking for me. Jake knew roughly where I'd gone, and he'd raise the alarm when I didn't return on schedule. But as night fell and the forest came alive with sounds, my optimism faded. I barricaded the door as best I could with the rickety furniture and huddled on the cot, straining my ears for any sound out of the ordinary. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by every creak of the cabin's old timbers and every hoot of an owl. But it wasn't until the early hours of the morning that true terror struck again. I was jolted awake by a sound I'd hoped never to hear again, that low, guttural howl that was neither fully human nor fully animal. It was close, too close. I held my breath, pressing myself against the wall of the cabin. There was a heavy thud outside, then the sound of sniffing, like a dog trying to catch a scent. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it must be audible. Something scraped against the outside wall of the cabin. Then, to my horror, a massive, hairy arm punched through one of the gaps between the logs. Clawed fingers groped blindly in the darkness. I bit down on my fist to keep from screaming, tasting blood. The arm withdrew, and for a moment there was silence. Then the whole cabin shook as something heavy slammed against the door. The barricade I'd created groaned but held. Another slam, and I saw the door frame splinter. In desperation, I looked around for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. My eyes fell on the pot-bellied stove. It was old and rusted, but it was made of cast iron. It would have to do. I grabbed it just as the door burst open. The creature filled the doorway, its massive form silhouetted against the night sky. In the dim light, I could see its eyes gleaming, fixed on me. With a strength born of pure terror, I hefted the stove and hurled it at the creature. There was a satisfying thunk as it connected, followed by a roar of pain and rage. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I dove through the window, feeling glass shards cut into my skin. I hit the ground rolling and was on my feet in an instant, running blindly into the forest. Behind me I could hear the creature's howls of fury, followed by the sound of pursuit. I ran like I'd never run before, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. But I knew that no matter how fast I ran, the thing behind me was faster. Just as I felt my strength giving out, my foot caught on a root and I went sprawling. I tumbled down a steep slope, the world spinning around me. I came to a stop at the bottom, dazed and winded. As I lay there, trying to catch my breath, I realized I couldn't hear the sounds of pursuit anymore. Had I lost it? Then I saw where I was, and my blood ran cold. I was in a small clearing, and it was filled with bones. Animal bones, human bones, all scattered about or piled in gruesome heaps. The stench of decay was overwhelming. I'd stumbled into the creature's lair. As the full horror of my situation sank in, a part of me wanted to curl up and give in to despair. But a stronger part, the part that had kept me alive so far, refused to give up. I forced myself to my feet, ignoring the protests of my battered body. I needed a weapon, something to defend myself with. My eyes darted around the clearing, looking for anything I could use. Among the bones and debris, something metallic caught my eye. I moved closer and felt a surge of hope. It was a hunting rifle, old and rusted, but potentially still functional. As the sun began to set, I overheard a heated discussion between the lead ranger and someone on the phone. Words like containment and classified floated over to me. I realized with a sinking feeling that the truth of what had happened here might never see the light of day. A ranger approached me, his face grave. "Mr. Sawyer," he said, "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to come with us. There are some people who want to talk to you about what you've seen here." I nodded numbly, too exhausted to argue. As they led me away from the clearing, I took one last look back. A team in hazmat suits was already at work, preparing to remove the creature's body. In a few days there would be no sign that anything out of the ordinary had ever happened here. The story that made the local news was predictably mundane. A hiker had gotten lost in the woods and was rescued after a few days. There was no mention of the creature, no hint of the terror I'd endured. Dr. Hartley's journal was nowhere to be found when I asked about it later. I was debriefed, sworn to secrecy, and eventually allowed to return home, but I knew I would never be the same. The wilderness I had once seen as a sanctuary now seemed full of shadows and hidden dangers. Months passed, and life gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy, but every now and then I'll wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that inhuman howl ringing in my ears, and on those nights I lie awake until dawn, wondering what other secrets the dark woods might be hiding. Sometimes ignorance truly is bliss, but once you've stared into the face of the impossible, there's no going back. The world is stranger and more dangerous than most people ever realize, and in the deep, dark places of the earth, who knows what might be watching and waiting. So if you ever find yourself alone in the wilderness, and you hear something that sounds almost but not quite human, run, and don't look back. Because not all legends are just stories, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. The biting wind whipped across my face as I stepped out of my car, the cold immediately seeping through my layers despite my careful preparation. It was a crisp winter morning at Indiana Dunes State Park, and the world around me was blanketed in a thick layer of pristine, white snow. The parking lot was deserted, my car the only vehicle in sight. The silence was almost eerie, broken only by the occasional creak of a tree branch heavy with snow. I had come here seeking solitude, a chance to clear my mind and escape the chaos of everyday life. Little did I know that this seemingly peaceful winter wonderland would soon become the backdrop for one of the most harrowing experiences of my life. As I locked my car and pocketed the keys, I took a moment to survey my surroundings. The familiar landscape of the park had been transformed into an alien terrain of white dunes and snow-laden trees. The lake, which I knew lay beyond the dunes, was nowhere in sight, obscured by the thick curtain of gently falling snow. I set off down what I assumed was the main trail, my boots crunching satisfyingly in the fresh powder. The world around me was muffled, every sound dampened by the snow. It felt as though I had stepped into another dimension, one where time stood still and the troubles of the world couldn't reach me. As I walked, my mind wandered to the events that had led me here. The stress of my job, the recent breakup with my long-term partner, the feeling of being lost in my own life. It had all become too much. This solo trip to Indiana Dunes was meant to be a reset, a chance to reconnect with myself and figure out my next steps. Lost in thought, I barely noticed as the terrain began to change. The gentle slopes of the dunes gave way to a vast, flat expanse. I assumed I had reached the beach, though the thick snow made it impossible to discern any features of the landscape. I pressed on, marveling at the untouched expanse before me. It wasn't until much later that I would realize the gravity of my mistake. In that moment, however, I was blissfully unaware of the danger lurking beneath my feet. I was walking on thin ice, quite literally, and my life was about to change forever. As I trudged through the snow, the wind picked up, driving icy particles into my face. I pulled my scarf tighter, grateful for the warmth it provided. The vast whiteness stretched out before me, unbroken and beautiful. I felt a sense of peace wash over me, the troubles that had driven me here momentarily forgotten. I must have walked for at least 20 minutes when I decided to take a break. I found a spot that seemed slightly elevated, perhaps a sand dune beneath the snow, and sat down. As I caught my breath, I reached for my water bottle, only to find it had frozen in the extreme cold. I chuckled to myself, amused by my lack of foresight. It was then that I heard it, a faint cracking sound beneath me. At first I dismissed it as the settling of snow, but as I shifted my weight, the sound intensified. A chill ran down my spine, and this time it wasn't from the cold. Slowly, carefully, I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a snow-covered beach. I was standing on the frozen lake. Panic threatened to overwhelm me as the gravity of my situation became clear. I had no idea how far out onto the lake I had wandered, or how thick the ice beneath my feet was. Every step could be my last. I turned back the way I had come, trying to retrace my steps, but the falling snow had already obscured my tracks. The shore was nowhere in sight, hidden behind a curtain of white. I felt utterly alone and terrifyingly vulnerable. With no other choice, I began to walk, each step cautious and measured. The cracking sounds continued, sometimes loud enough to make me freeze in place, my heart in my throat. Time seemed to stretch, minutes feeling like hours as I inched my way across the treacherous ice. As I walked, my mind raced. How could I have been so careless? I thought of my family, my friends. Would they ever know what happened to me if the worst came to pass? The weight of my mortality pressed down on me, heavier than the thickest winter coat. I don't know how long I had been walking when I saw it, a dark shape in the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow. At first I thought it might be a hallucination, a trick of my fear-addled mind. But as I drew closer, the shape solidified into a sign. Relief flooded through me as I approached the sign, but it was short-lived. The words on the sign sent a fresh wave of terror through me. Danger, thin ice ahead, do not proceed. I had made it back to the shore, but the realization of how close I had come to disaster hit me hard. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the snow-covered ground, my body shaking with a mixture of relief and residual fear. As I sat there catching my breath and letting the reality of my narrow escape sink in, I became aware of just how quiet and empty the park was. If something had happened to me out on that ice, who knows how long it would have been before anyone found me. Slowly, I got to my feet and made my way back to the parking lot. My car stood alone, a solitary sentinel in the winter landscape. As I drove away from Indiana Dunes State Park, my hand still shaking on the steering wheel, I knew that this experience had changed me profoundly. In the days and weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about that day on the ice, the fragility of life, the importance of awareness, the power of nature. All of these thoughts swirled in my mind like the snow that had nearly been my undoing. In the months following my near-death experience at Indiana Dunes, I found myself struggling with unexpected consequences. Nightmares plagued my sleep, vivid recreations of that day on the ice. Only in these dreams, I wasn't so lucky. I'd wake up gasping, my sheets drenched in sweat, the phantom sensation of icy water closing over my head, lingering even in the warm safety of my bedroom. My family and friends noticed the change in me. I became withdrawn, jumpy at unexpected sounds, and reluctant to venture out in winter weather. My sister Sarah finally confronted me about it over coffee one chilly autumn morning. "You're not yourself," she said, her brow furrowed with concern. "Have you considered talking to someone about what happened?" I bristled at first, defensive. "I'm fine," I insisted. "It was just a close call, that's all." But Sarah's words stuck with me, and eventually I found myself sitting in a therapist's office, recounting my experience to Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a specialist in trauma and PTSD. As I worked with Dr. Rodriguez, I began to realize that my experience at Indiana Dunes had dredged up long-buried fears and insecurities. We delved into my childhood, exploring the roots of my need for solitude and my tendency to push myself to dangerous limits. I remembered a day from my youth when I was just 10 years old. My father, an avid outdoorsman, had taken me ice fishing on a small lake near our home. "Always respect the ice," he had told me, demonstrating how to test its thickness with an auger. "Nature doesn't care if you're not ready for her challenges." That day we had heard a loud crack echo across the lake. My father's face had gone pale, and he'd rushed us off the ice, pulling me along behind him. We'd made it to shore safely, but the memory of that sound, so similar to what I'd heard at Indiana Dunes, had been buried in my subconscious for years. Through our sessions, Dr. Rodriguez helped me understand how this childhood experience had shaped my adult behaviors, including my solo trip to the dunes in winter. I was subconsciously trying to prove something to myself, to conquer a fear I didn't even know I had. As winter approached again, I felt a familiar dread building inside me. But this time, instead of retreating, I decided to face my fears head-on. I enrolled in a winter survival course, learning proper techniques for navigating icy conditions and recognizing potential dangers. During the course I met Jack, a gruff but kind-hearted retired park ranger. When I shared my story with him, his eyes lit up with recognition. "I remember that day," he said, shaking his head. "I was off duty, but I drove by the park on my way home, saw a lone car in the lot and had a bad feeling about it. I called it in, and they sent a patrol out to check." I was stunned. "That was you? I had no idea anyone even knew I was there." Jack nodded solemnly. "In this line of work, you develop a sixth sense for trouble. I'm glad you made it out okay." Our conversation sparked an idea. With Jack's encouragement, I began volunteering at Indiana Dunes, helping to educate visitors about winter safety and the hidden dangers of the park. A year to the day after my ill-fated walk on the frozen lake, I stood at the edge of Indiana Dunes State Park, leading a group of hikers on a winter safety tour. The snow crunched beneath our boots as we made our way along the shore, the frozen expanse of Lake Michigan stretching out before us. As we reached the spot where I had unknowingly ventured onto the ice a year ago, I paused, taking in the scene. The park had installed new, larger warning signs, partly due to my advocacy efforts over the past year. "This spot right here," I told the group, my voice carrying on the crisp winter air, "is where I learned one of the most important lessons of my life." I shared my story with them, watching as their eyes widened in understanding. As I spoke, I felt a sense of closure washing over me. The fear and trauma that had haunted me for so long began to loosen their grip. One of the hikers, a young woman named Maya, approached me after the tour. "Your story really moved me," she said. "I've always loved winter sports, but I never really thought about the dangers. Thank you for opening my eyes." Her words warmed me more than any winter gear could. I realized that by sharing my experience, I was not only healing myself, but potentially saving others from making the same mistakes I had. Encouraged by the response to my tours and safety talks, I decided to write a book about my experience and the broader issue of winter safety in natural parks. The process of writing was therapeutic, allowing me to explore my thoughts and feelings in depth. I interviewed park rangers, survival experts, and other individuals who had close calls in winter conditions. Their stories, woven together with my own, created a tapestry of caution and respect for nature's power. As I wrote, I also delved into the science behind ice formation on large bodies of water, the psychology of risk-taking in nature, and the history of winter recreation in national and state parks. The project consumed me, giving me a new purpose and direction. During my research for the book, I came across a news article about a family who had lost their son to a similar accident on a frozen lake in Minnesota. Moved by their story, I reached out to them, unsure of how they would respond. To my surprise, the Andersons, Tom, Lisa, and their daughter Emma, were eager to talk. We met over video call, and as I shared my story and listened to theirs, I felt a profound connection forming. After we lost Kyle, Lisa said, her eyes glistening with tears, we felt so alone in our grief. Hearing your story, knowing that someone understands the dangers and is working to prevent similar tragedies, it gives his death some meaning. The Andersons agreed to contribute to my book, sharing Kyle's story as a poignant reminder of what's at stake. Our collaboration led to a friendship that would prove invaluable in the years to come. As my book neared completion, I realized that I wanted to do more than just write about the issue. With the help of the Andersons, Jack, and other allies I'd made along the way, I launched a national campaign for improved winter safety measures in parks across the country. We lobbied for better signage, increased funding for winter patrols, and enhanced education programs for park visitors. Our efforts caught the attention of several state legislators, and soon we found ourselves testifying before committee hearings, sharing our stories and pushing for change. The campaign was exhausting but exhilarating. For every setback there was a small victory. Slowly but surely we began to see changes implemented in parks around the nation. 5 years after my near-fatal walk on the ice, I returned to Indiana Dunes State Park for the grand opening of the new Winter Safety Center. The small building located near the spot where I had first ventured onto the frozen lake was a testament to years of hard work and advocacy. As I cut the ribbon, surrounded by park officials, local politicians, and many of the people who had been part of my journey, I felt a sense of completion. The terrified, naive person who had walked out onto that ice half a decade ago was gone, replaced by someone wiser, more cautious, but also more connected to the world around them. Looking back on that winter day at Indiana Dunes, I'm struck by how a single misstep, literal and figurative, can change the course of a life. My walk on thin ice could have ended in tragedy, but instead it became the catalyst for growth, change, and a newfound purpose. I've learned that life often places us on thin ice, testing our resilience and adaptability. The key is not to avoid these challenges altogether, but to approach them with respect, preparation, and a willingness to learn from our mistakes and the wisdom of others. My journey from a solitary walker in a snowy park to an advocate for winter safety has taught me the power of community, the importance of facing our fears, and the profound impact that sharing our stories can have on others. As I stand here today, watching visitors explore the new Winter Safety Center, I'm reminded of the countless unseen dangers that surround us every day, but I'm also filled with hope, knowing that through education, awareness, and mutual support, we can navigate even the most treacherous paths. The frozen lake that nearly claimed my life has become a symbol of transformation and resilience. It's a reminder that sometimes our greatest challenges can lead us to our true calling. If only we have the courage to step carefully, listen to the warnings around us, and reach out to others along the way. And so, my story continues, no longer a solitary journey on thin ice, but a shared expedition towards greater understanding and respect for the delicate balance between human adventure and nature's awesome power. Hello everyone, my name is Sam, and this happened to me a few nights back. For context, I live in the middle of the woods in mid-Wisconsin. I've listened to every episode of this podcast and know exactly what I heard and even saw. It started as any other day. I was doing my daily routine I follow, and I went outside to let my dog use the bathroom and everything else she likes to do when I heard a large thud to my right and heard my mom calling me. The thing is, my mom died 2 years ago, but to my right is just forest, so I just chalked it up to a tree falling since it had rained really hard the past few days, and my dog and I went inside to continue our day. It was about noon and I had classes. I'm a college student taking online classes. I have my headphones in, and listening to music when out of nowhere my dog goes ballistic, like non-stop barking and growling. This is unusual for her as she's a very calm dog, So I take off my headphones and go to see what's going on. I look outside and see a coyote, which is normal where I'm from, so I calm her and take a closer look. But something is off with this thing, and I chalked it up to it being in a fight. My dog is calm, and so I go back to my studies. It's about 4 in the afternoon at this time, and I feed my dog, and we're just relaxing, winding down for bed, and I let her out to do her business. After a couple hours, it's about 10, and it's getting dark. So I let her out again one last time, and this is when it happened. I'm standing outside waiting for her to sniff and do her thing, when I hear a coyote a mile or so away. So I'm trying to get my dog to hurry up a little. Then to my right where the woods are, I hear another coyote. But it was wrong sounding, really wrong. It sounded growled and distorted. I thought maybe something was wrong with it until I heard it again and knew exactly what it was. The sight of it just confirmed my suspicion. It was a skinwalker trying to be a coyote. I saw a mangy-looking coyote come out of the woods a few hundred feet away, and it was big. Way too big to be natural. And that's when I knew we were in danger. I looked at my dog, who was now shaking and had her tail tucked, and I knew she wasn't going to move. I took a quick breath and ran for my dog. I grabbed her just as the thing was running at her, and I ran like hell. I ran so fast I felt like I wasn't even in my own body. I am a 250-pound male, which played linebacker, but I was a slower person, but I never ran so fast in my life. I heard the thing crash to the ground. I figured it was trying to pounce on me to kill me or my dog, and then it was the most spine-tingling scream or yell. I don't know what it was, but it was a horrible sound. I ran inside my home and shut the door so quickly I thought I broke it, and I locked the door. I've only told a few people about this, but only one has really took me seriously. I was hoping that posting this encounter here will help me in some way to cope with what happened. My dog and I are fine. We've been shaken for a little while, but we're good. I just don't understand. I was skeptical about these things, thought they were stories, but now I'm a believer. We haven't been outside at night since, and I still occasionally hear the cry of that thing. If you hear a strange noise, do not ignore it, no matter what you think it may be. My wonderful friends, I'm eagerly waiting to read your comments about the stories and sagas that captivated you the most. Was there a tale that thrilled or terrified you? Share your impressions and opinions fearlessly. I will read your feedback with the utmost excitement. Your comments are the fuel for this journey. Don't hesitate. Tell me what's on your mind. You are my cherished companion, so don't let me down.